is Kate Stevenson. I want to welcome you all to Montpelier for this workshop. And thanks so much for everyone who brought food. There's a ton of it, so we're going to have time to get up and have seconds and thirds later. But do whatever you need to do. And there's also a bathroom in the back corner there. There's also a sign-up sheet that has a consent form that we're asking everyone to sign. We have Orca Media here recording the presentation today, and so that's just giving your permission in case you get caught on video. But I want to introduce Evan Perkins, who is a skater. He is a farmer. He is a teacher. And has a ton of experience to share with us about big ice skating and safety and leadership. So,
all right, great. Hey, well, thanks everybody for coming, and I recognize a lot of faces, but probably there'd be more people I recognized if you had your helmet and goggles on, because I've met a lot of you folks out on the ice. So, as Kate said, my name's Evan Perkins. My experience in this matter, just to start with, just like my personal experience, I've been skating with kind of mostly proper knowledge and techniques in the Nordic skating community here in New England for, I think, about 15 or 16 years. But I, grew up skating, as a lot of us did, on ponds and swamps. And for folks who grew up in rural New England, that was kind of just how childhood was. I also, in my one of my past careers of leading expeditions up in the Canadian Arctic, I spent a lot of time on ice in my 20s, dragging canoes across the ice on big ice. This was kind of rotten spring ice, but that was all really helpful, a really helpful base of knowledge that helped to inform me when I started skating on bigger bodies of water, on wild ice. And I would say that I learned, some of my knowledge, like all of us, I just learned through experience out there. A lot I learned early on when I first got on the listserv before I figured out how to post on it or anything, from reading reports from fellows like Dan Spada over there, who's in the back. Just other skaters who were reporting and giving detailed reports that gave me enough information to then go out and learn for myself. So that's kind of where I'm coming from this. I don't think this is a subject, kind of like my other career, farming, that one could ever be considered a master or an expert at. It's a really dynamic subject. There's a lot of variables involved, so I don't consider myself either of those things. But I do have a lot of experience. I've thought about it a lot, and the purpose of this presentation is to share some of that knowledge that I feel I've gained, and then also to create a discussion point and a start of a conversation that hopefully can disperse from this room for folks to be adding their own knowledge and spreading this knowledge within our skating community. Because I think a lot of the ways that we educate ourselves is through meeting people on the ice and reading the listserv, and that's an imperfect way. The internet is an imperfect delivery system for education, because it tends to just give you pieces, not always with context. So I thought being in a room together might be helpful for all of us. Chi, I was just wondering, just a general sense of, if you maybe want to go a general sense of the schedule for the evening, just to remind folks, and obviously we can be flexible with that, but.
Yeah, no, it's just a general flexible schedule. It's like what I wrote.
Okay, great.
But they'll be broken up into 3 sessions, 2 sessions on big ice, and then 1 session on ice rescue, and then we'll have break in between to eat more.
Great. And so my general thought is I did want to spend about 2/3 of the time on big lake ice skating, just because I think that's a good topic, and also in light of kind of the recent rescue that happened on Lake Champlain, a good time to have it. And also, most of us in this room have probably been skating recently, and so it's a good time to to have this class, even though we don't know what the rest of the skating season will bring. And as far as rescue, I was going to be a little bit more informal about that because this is geared towards an intermediate audience, so I hope most folks in this room have a basic sense of the different options we have for ice rescue, but I wanted to create a space to talk about maybe some details of rescue leadership, and then maybe also talk about some of the intricacies of the different rescue systems we have and some tips to make them more effective. So that's my general thoughts for the evening. I would be happy to field questions as we go along. If they're too much or I'm in the middle of something, I'll just let you know, but feel free to raise your hand and ask a question, or if you feel like you have a comment that would be helpful because I've overlooked something or there's something to add, I'm comfortable with that as well. So, great. And let's see, yeah. See if I can get this working here. Okay, great. So big lake ice skating, just to start, does anybody in the crowd can give us any sense of what they feel a big lake is as opposed to a large pond or a small lake? Like not a specific location, but what are some things that qualify a lake as a big lake?
Pressure ridges that move.
Okay, so big enough to form pressure ridges, that's a good start. Generally, you need a mile of water in one direction or another as a general rule for a lake to form pressure ridges. So if a lake is less than a mile in either direction, it's less likely, it's not impossible, but less likely to form major pressure ridges. So pressure ridges being a major hazard and one of the things that keep lake ice really dynamic, we need to be a big lake, it's got to be of the size to form pressure ridges. That being said, I think there's a lot of lakes in that intermediate size that can form pressure ridges, but because of their shape or their size, don't have a lot of these big lake issues that we're going to talk about. But in general, it's size. And what are some examples we have in our region of big lakes that pop to mind? We've got the big one, yeah. We've got Champlain.
I think Mallett's Bay
Mallett's
on its own.
Mallett's Bay is a big lake. Outer Mallett's Bay is a separate big lake. The Inland Sea is a separate big lake. The Broads of Lake Champlain, and that really is going to go from Isle Lamont to Essex, in my opinion, because that tends to be this big dynamic range in there. And then we've got south of the bridge, so south of Crown Point Bridge, and then north of Crown Point Bridge, which goes up to what people often refer to as the Narrows. That's the area south of Split Rock where the Palisades are. Those are all separate sections and all big lakes on their own with their own dynamics, and people who have spent any time in any of those regions know they all have their own personality and their own things that you can expect. So yeah, and then other big lakes are Lake Memphremagog over in Newport, Vermont. That's probably our other biggest lake in Vermont, which is a big dynamic lake which goes well into Quebec as well. And then Lake Willoughby, I think, is another good one to consider. And then, yes? Bombazine? Yep, Bombazine. Yeah, so I think there are several bodies of water in Vermont that would we would categorize as big lakes. And I think a lake I'll probably mention a lot also is Lake Winnipesaukee in New Hampshire, although it's out of the range for many of us. For me, since I live on the New Hampshire border, it's pretty close to me. That's a really unique big lake that's just completely different from Lake Champlain and what goes on there because of its topography and its shape.
Is Sunapee big?
Yes, Sunapee, yep. Yeah, once we get into the lakes region, we've got Squam, Sunapee, Winnisquam. Those are all very sizable lakes there. So that's kind of what I'm talking about when I talk about a big lake, are these bigger bodies of water. Here's my friend Jesse out on Champlain the other day. This is This is ice. This is an ice pile that was formed on the day that all that ice blew out, and there was rescues on Lake Champlain. So this is some of the ice that was over there that was missing when those folks went to get to shore, one way or the other. So I've got some what I consider the things that make big lakes different, and the first one being wind. There's wind on every lake, but the effect that wind has on a large piece of ice is just different than the effect that it has on a small piece of ice. That's merely due to size. I like to think of sheets of ice as sails in that they, when a small amount of wind on a very large area can move something very quickly. So the kind of wind you might have on a small lake or pond is going to just react differently on a big lake. Ice movement. How is ice movement different on a big lake? What are some things that physically move ice? What's that?
Wind.
Yeah, wind is one of them, but what else?
Current.
Yeah, we might have some lake current. What else?
More space for it to move to. Open water.
Yeah, so if you have unevenly frozen place, you have that relates to movement in that on a big lake, you're more likely to have a partially frozen environment. Other things that were mentioned earlier are pressure ridges. That is ice movement. Contraction and expansion is ice movement. And on a large piece of ice, that movement can be dramatic, both with contraction and expansion. And then I think just the general thing is the larger the size, the larger the forces involved. The bigger the pressure ridges, the more dynamic they are, the greater the effect of wind, the greater the effect of expansion and contraction. And then lastly, I am going to cover a little bit about reservoirs because the water is actively going up and down, and another big lake like Moore Reservoir and Comerford Reservoir, which are on the New Hampshire-Vermont borders, which I've skated on a lot, have really radical changes in water, in the height of the water in the lake. So I think that's really important to consider, and particularly for our friends in Scandinavia who skate on the ocean a lot and on the coast of Maine. The tide creates that kind of reservoir effect as well. Anything to add to this?
One of the other things I wonder about is there's the movement of the ice.
Yeah.
But is the likelihood of forming wind holes greater when you're on a big body of water as opposed to a small one?
So wind holes is a situation where, say, a lake skims over, but it's windy, and there are sections when it looks like it appears everything is frozen, but there are sections either small or large that the wind keeps open. And I would say, in general, yes, the bigger the piece of a piece of ice, the more likely it is you'll have wind holes, because ice does not freeze in one like it gets cold enough and then the whole lake freezes across. That's really not how it works. Ice grows starting often from many different locations, joins together, and then fully locks in a lake. So the larger the lake, the more likely you are to have a place that in the 2 hours of the night that it was calm, when 3/4 of the lake froze, that last quarter didn't, and then the wind picked up to 4 miles an hour and kept some wind holes open. That being said, you can have wind holes on a tiny pond. So they're going to form in all locations, but you do have, on what you would consider a calm night, where you would expect everything to freeze solid, that's much less likely to happen on a big lake, because this ice, we've all seen the crystals grow in puddles in our driveway, and they've got to grow and connect, and very rarely do they all start at the same place at the same time growing. So that's a big difference, and I think a good point. But wind holes are everywhere. Great. Any other things to add to this?
I guess I'd just say you're further from the shore. Or you could be further from the shore.
Yes.
You could be on the big lake and be on the edge.
Yes, and I'll talk about that a little later about like just the sheer size and what that means for us in terms of rescue planning, how we operate on big lakes. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit here about pressure ridging. Raise your hand here if you've seen a pressure ridge in real life. Good. Okay, so we don't need to go too much into the basics of it. I think something that is really important to identify the difference between is thin ice pressure ridging and thick ice pressure ridging. So thin ice pressure ridging being, let's assume that the ice we're talking about is supportable. So we're going with 2 inches, okay? I would say thin ice pressure ridging is in that in between that 2 and 4 inch range. That I would consider that thin ice. And then thick ice pressure ridging is pressure ridging that happens above that. What would be the difference between these two things? Why do we need to create, when conditions are present to form pressure ridges, why do we need to treat these two situations really differently? There's different risks, but what's different about a pressure ridge that forms on thin ice as it pertains? Let's call this 2 inch ice, right? So it's supportable ice with not a lot of margin for error. What's different about approaching, crossing, dealing with pressure ridges on 2 inches of ice?
I would think if it's thin, if you step on it, you're going to have it tip in and get you wet.
Yeah, so generally, like when we go to cross a pressure ridge, right, if it's a traditional overlapping pressure ridge, which this kind of is in the picture here, we've got ice driven up on top of other ice. When we go to step across a pressure ridge, we're looking for a place usually where it's overlapped, where the ice is strong enough to support us, or we can step across whatever is open there in the middle. With thin ice pressure ridging, you might have this exact same situation, but because it's only 2 inch ice, and particularly if that ice is weak for any reason, when you step on that edge or even close to the pressure ridge, it can just break off. So it's much more dangerous to cross pressure ridges when they're thin, and they're also much more likely. I have blowouts here, but this really, what I really meant by this is collapsed pressure ridges. It's much more likely for a thin ice pressure ridge to completely collapse, meaning that it overlapped and then all these junctions broke, and then you've just got this kind of lead full of floating ice. And that matters for us on a big lake because if we're choosing to go out on thin ice on a big lake and then we're out there when it gets warm and pressure ridging starts, you could get into a situation where those pressure ridges close off all of your avenues behind you, and you're out in the middle of the lake with nothing that you can cross to get back to shore. So I think you know, like I know like south of the bridge is a great example. There's just like a lot of times when south of the bridge will freeze and it'll be relatively thin ice, and then, you know, people will skate it, and then it will get warm, and then it's like, you know, you got a portage around shore, all different kinds of stuff, and then that ice, because of current or wind, will go away, and the whole thing will start again. So that's thin ice pressure ridging. So I think it's really important to make the difference between that and thick ice pressure ridging, where it's much more likely on thick ice that you're going to find a place to cross. And so the important thing to remember, if you're on a place that's big enough to form pressure ridges and you're on thin ice, your margin of safety is a lot more narrow, and your temperature range that you can skate that ice in. And by temperature range, I mean how cold it is outside now, but really like how much the temperature is rising during the day, because that's going to create pressure ridging, is the change in temperature from cold to warm. So we need to be really conscious of that, and especially on a big lake where you're far from shore and you could just get trapped out there. And then not only are you trapped out there, but you're trapped out there on really thin ice that if the wind picks up can just dissolve. And then in terms of things that affect pressure ridging, I have underwater and above water topography. So what are in people's observation, where are places that you typically see pressure ridges form? Yeah, a point of land is a really classic one. Yep.
Islands.
In between, yeah, islands, in between islands. Islands themselves is a 360-degree point of land in a lake. So from any direction, although typically if you know a lake, the pressure ridges form in similar places most of the time. But that really does depend on how, with a big lake, on how it freezes up. And then we've got folded pressure ridges, and that would be a pressure ridge that folds down, and then that water, open water in the middle, can skim over, and so you can have a perfectly flat surface and then a skim of water that you can just skate right into. So those are the hardest to see, and I do have some pictures of those. And then overlapped, which is more like this. We're always looking for those overlap spots to cross. Typically, we're looking for corners or places where the ice has switched from overlapping on one side to overlapping on the other side, and usually there's a spot to cross in there. And then by blowouts, I mean collapsed pressure ridges, and those are just pressure ridges that it's gotten warm enough, maybe pressure has been relieved someplace else on the lake and they've separated a little bit, and that ice, which was all broken up and folded over itself, just kind of collapses into the water. Typically these happen during warm-ups, but they can happen at other times.
Question?
Yes.
The other day on the listserv, Jamie Hess described on Sebago literal blowouts where the pressure ridge was actively coming together and there was ice flying. Anybody else read that
Yep.
description? Is that the same thing as a blowout, or is that something different?
Yeah, I mean, basically that's just you're there the moment it forms. Yeah, you're there the moment it forms. I think I've got some good pictures. So this is a good example of what ice looks like on black ice before a pressure ridge forms. Like probably about 3 minutes later, this was on Winnipesaukee, I believe. 3 minutes later, this exploded. And because it was under so much, and it wasn't violent. I don't think you're going to be hurt by a piece of flying ice, although that it's not impossible probably. It's more just that we skated over this, and you could just see the tortured tension in the ice, and then we weren't much past it, and then we heard it go, and looked back, and all of a sudden there was a pressure ridge that was probably about on 3 inches of ice. They don't always look like that, but yeah.
Going back to the thin versus thick
Yeah.
ice pressure ridges, would you say that it's more typical to see water on top of the ice on a thin pressure ridge, which I saw this season for the first time, and I was wondering if just because thick, maybe it's just further to the water surface, but I didn't know if that was characteristic.
Yeah, I mean, I think we would probably have to characterize thick and thin, and then also characterize between snow ice and black ice as well. But once ice gets over a foot thick, and particularly if there's snow ice involved in it, it's a bit more buoyant, and so you would maybe have less water. But in general, you see those big pools of open water beside all different types of pressure ridges. Once ice gets really thick, it's less common because the ice is buoyant and it's above the surface of the water. Yes.
I wanted to mention something about the force. It's unbelievable the force of the ice. For example, I was on Willoughby fishing one day, and there was this much ice as we were out by the boat launch. The wind was blowing from the north, probably 15 miles an hour.
Yep.
There was no pressure ridge from the red camp yet.
Yep.
Across, and we were having our lunch, stuff on our coolers, and all of a sudden the pressure ridge exploded, everything fell off the side. We thought the world was coming to an end.
Yeah.
When we looked out, you could still see the ice flying,
Yeah.
and the ridge formed this high, right across. We watched it.
Yeah. And just the vibration from that knocked everything. Your coolers weren't on the ridge, but yeah.
It was like a quake.
The first time I ever stepped foot on Lake Champlain on ice skates was Bob Dill had listed a group skate in 2014. I think we were going to put it in Converse Bay, and then we went to Town Farm Bay, or one or the other. And I was so excited to be able to skate out on the lake. It was that year the ice was thick and black. The big lake was still open at this point, and there was a south wind blowing, and we were in the Narrows, so we put in farther down, but the ice was really thick in the Narrows. It was probably 10 inches. And I walked out and I put on my skates and I stood on the ice, and everybody else was still on shore, and we just heard this tremendous bam, like huge boom, like a cannon shot, and I moved about 10 feet down the shoreline on the ice. Because a ridge had let go somewhere else out there, and all of a sudden I was just sliding along and watching Bob go by me. Yeah, that was my first introduction to Lake Champlain, so I paid attention the rest of the day. Yep.
You were talking about temperature change. Can you give a rough idea? Are we talking 10 degrees, 15 degrees?
Okay, so temperature change, having whether it's black ice or and whether it's snow ice makes a difference, particularly if it's sunny, because with black ice everything heats up much quicker if the sun can get through the ice. So, but yeah, I think of like a 20-degree temperature change. I'm on high alert for a lot of activity, although it can certainly happen with less, particularly if it's sunny. But anytime there's that kind of range, which is pretty typical. And then we this time of year, particularly, like if we have a year when the lakes freeze later, we're having these nights, that are in the low single digits, but the day is going up, will go up to above 30. On those days, it's going to be outrageous. Particularly if pressure ridge activity has not occurred already. Like say the ice has been snow covered or it's been cloudy for days, and then it gets blown off, and then it's sunny, but it's thick. There's going to be a lot of activity on that day. So that 20 degrees is kind of like my alert. This is definitely going to happen. But clouds really make a difference. Snow ice makes a difference. So there are variables involved. But any day you're looking at new ice that's formed that that doesn't have a lot of pressure ridges yet, and there's going to be temperature change, be aware. Here's another, this is an example of, this is actually, although it looks very similar to the last picture, this is, trying to think, I think this is a lake over in Maine. This was from several years back, so I don't have exactly where it is, but you can see that exact same look to it, but the ice is actively forming a folded pressure ridge in this picture. And it's also connected to probably thin ice out there, which is bringing in water directly. Even though this hasn't broken open yet here, it's bringing in water from that thin ice edge, and then forming a folded pressure ridge. So you can imagine that then, that freezes over, and that gets much deeper, and then freezes over, and then creates a hazard that wasn't there the day before. Great. This was on Lake Champlain heading over to Isle La Motte earlier in the season. It's kind of a classic overlap ridge there. And ridges start to look messy and aren't always this clean shape because they contract and expand many times. And so, this ice, I think here was probably about 8 inches thick, but you can see these shards sticking up are maybe 2 or 3, and that's probably because there was open water, it contracted again, pushed those up. Maybe it'll open again, create some more water around it, and so it'll create these shards. I remember being on Lake Champlain when the Broads froze in 2014, which is the last time I believe it was 2014, it could have been 15. I don't remember, Dan, do you remember if there was good skating in 2015 when the lake froze? On the Broads, that might have been the year on the.
Either 14 or 15.
Yeah, there was like one year the Broads were for 3 weeks were beautiful 2-foot black ice, and I remember crossing 4-foot pressure ridges that were just incredible because they were pressure ridges formed on a couple feet of ice. Okay, great. So I want to talk about wind here. Wind is, when we start getting onto big lakes, it's that big factor. If anybody's been paying attention to Lake Champlain, it's the thing that really, we really have to pay attention to. Wind direction, how much of it is, how long it's been blowing from a particular direction, whether that wind has shifted. These are all things we'll talk about. So wind affects ice movement. And so this is, let's see, this is the shoreline of South Hero. I think on the same day I took that other pressure ridge, but these are 10-inch thick blocks of ice. And that's ice that cleared from the main lake in a storm, because this was all, it was frozen out to here somewhere, and then probably 5-foot waves blew up the lake in a storm and piled just these massive blocks of ice on the shoreline there. So I'm going to talk a little bit about plate shearing. So big plates of ice breaking apart. And then plate underthinning by wave action. Has anybody ever experienced this? So this is common. Typically what'll happen is like a lake will freeze thick, but it won't freeze completely, and, because of wind or whatever, it's kept open. And then there'll be a warm up. And so you've got an ice edge that say is, 8 inches thick. But then you've got sun-warmed water on the surface. You've got, like if you have on-ice wind, so wind blowing onto the ice from the lake, which is blowing water from the surface of the lake underneath the ice. And if it's been sunny or you've had above freezing days, that water may be warmer and is just slowly eroding, just like current would. It's under thinning ice. This is really common on Lake Winnipesaukee. I've seen this a lot. I don't feel like I've encountered this as much as on Champlain, because generally, like when wind's blowing, like when the wind starts to blow, it really blows here and just destroys stuff or creates a massive rubble band. But it's something to pay attention to, because it may be the kind of thing that made ice that was great on one day not supportable on another day. Also, it also will drive air bubbles under the ice. And what I've seen it do on lakes, which is particularly challenging, is on lakes that started as black ice and then got snowed on, and so then they have a bunch of slush or snow ice on top. I've seen many situations where underthinning by wave action has eroded away all of that black ice. So you still have some thickness there, maybe 3 or 4 inches, but it's really weak slush ice, even though the whole lake did start with a nice black ice base, which will make that ice in the future grow with small grain ice crystals, which will be weaker when they're warm, particularly. But also, if people have ever been on ice that has a really hollow sound, that's often ice that doesn't have a black ice underlayment to it. That is just snow ice. And this is one of you'll get that on rivers often, and you'll get that on any place where there's underthinning. So that's often where that hollow sound comes from, because it's even if a lake forms with snow ice, typically it's going to grow with black ice underneath that isn't going to create that hollow sound. So we've talked a little bit about this with wind, uneven ice formation. So wind holes, leads, and a lead is different than a pressure ridge, which might create a big opening in the lake. But a lead is where ice sheets are blown apart and then you just have open water. Plate breakup. So as opposed to plate shearing, plate breakup is where, and this is very typical in the Broads of Champlain, where you'll have a huge plate of ice, it'll blow out into the lake and just dissolve, just be broken apart in wave action. And then really critical is on ice versus off ice wind. Why does that matter to us? And what does it mean? Let's start with on ice wind. What does that mean?
For me, I would imagine waves are hitting it, which magnifies the damage to the ice edge.
Yeah, so if you're on the ice, it's always relative to you and the ice you're on. So if you're on the ice and the wind is blowing towards you from open water, generally it's the difference between open water and ice. That's when we refer to on ice and off ice wind. So it will be blowing towards the ice, and that can do a lot of things. On ice wind can break up ice, especially with big waves. That tends to be a slow process. And on a big lake like Lake Champlain, if there is ice someplace else in the lake, so you've got like your ice edge here, you've got wind blowing onto it, and then there's waves, and it's breaking everything apart into polygons and platelets. If there's ice somewhere else on the lake that's being blown up against that edge, it's going to form a rubble band that will actually protect the ice you're on. So on-ice wind doesn't tend to break up ice as quickly. If it's thin or the waves are big, it definitely will. And then off-ice wind. So we're on that same thick edge, big open lake here. What does off-ice wind mean to us? Yeah, so it's coming from here, and then this is the open lake out here. What are our dangers there? Yeah, so it can move a whole plate. You can have plate shearing. It could move a small piece that you're on. Then you're at great risk. Off-ice wind is when you're at great risk. That, in terms of the rescue that happened on Champlain, that's essentially what happened. It was a little more complicated than that, but essentially that's what happened. And so that's often a signal just not to be there. So here's a satellite photo of the lake. I forget the exact dates, but this was one day on Lake Champlain, and it was after, this was after kind of that plate had blown out down south, and there'd been a lot of movement on the lake. There had been a big storm from the north, which opened up a bunch of water in a bunch of different places, a lot on the New York shore. But this was all frozen up here before this. And then there was bigger sections of open water down here and here and here. And we had a storm coming from the northwest. And basically what it did is it crunched all these relatively thick ice plates over onto the Vermont side. So that was that strong northwest wind that did that. And so that next day, after this is a good picture, but it's kind of opposite. So this is looking now from the north of the lake. And so this is the New York side where all that open ice was. Somewhere in that night, the wind shifted from northwest to northeast, and so that next morning we woke up after that satellite picture, and all of that open water was now on the Vermont side. And that was pretty strong wind, that storm, and the wind was supposed to be coming out of the northwest most of the time. I think it just briefly, at some point it shifted to the northeast before it ended, and that was enough to move mass quantities of ice. And so then this took this opportunity for new black ice away from the New Yorkers and gave it to the Vermonters. That ice is still there. It still kind of looks like that today. It's frozen. Probably there was some skating out there today, but because of snow showers and stuff, I don't think anybody's been on it much since that happened. Although after this happened, we did skate this shoreline on the edge. So we did skate next to all of that. So that's just an example of one day and a subtle shift in the wind and creating massive movement. Okay, so does anybody know where this is?
Is that Erie?
Yeah, this is Lake Erie, and this was like on the news, this enormous 80-mile crack that formed on Lake Erie. Why did people think this crack formed? This ice, the ice on this lake was well over a foot thick in most places and about a foot thick in a lot of most of the lake was about a foot thick, and it was mostly kind of flow ice and stuff. Does anybody know why this enormous crack would have formed in a lake that appears mostly frozen?
East wind?
What's that?
An east wind?
Yeah, so it could have been an east wind or a southeast wind, and then there was probably before that a very strong north wind, right, that wherever there was thin ice had crunched this whole lake and kept this northern shoreline open. This may have even frozen, but at some point a wind came from the south or the east, and then because there was room to move here, room for this big pack to move, if it had been frozen to the shoreline, probably wouldn't have happened. This ice got pushed up and created this 80-mile crack, which I did watch it on satellite. It did crunch back together, but it would have been a great skate.
How wide do you think that crack is up there where it's the widest? Just perspective, I don't.
Well, I know it was supposed to be. I think it was measured as 80 miles long, so that's probably a couple miles. Yeah, it's probably quite big up there at the top. But under the right conditions, like if it had gotten calm and everything had frozen, that black ice crack could have frozen in the middle of that lake, and that lake's pretty much completely frozen at this point, and would have been a pretty amazing thing. And then a very similar, and this still exists out on the lake probably. It may or may not have frozen over. And I know they've somebody randomly has declared Lake Champlain frozen. I don't think it is. I would consider a lake frozen when you can have a big windstorm and it's the next day it's not going to have open water on it. I think this big crack a couple days ago, the day before yesterday, I think is when this was still open all the way from Port Kent over to Colchester Point. And it's quite wide, and there were other cracks in the lake as well. There have been wind shifts, so my suspicion is that this crack here on Lake Champlain still exists. If it's frozen, it's got thin ice, so it's still susceptible to be broken open, and so there was basically just a big amount of ice that could move in the lake as of yesterday, and probably still can, depending on what happens. If it calms out enough for these cracks to fully freeze, then the lake will be frozen a bit more stable. But so we had the same thing, and I think that was about 9 miles long, that crack there. So I think these are cool and interesting so you can understand the cataclysmic forces at work in a big lake. One of the things I think that we always think about, like for folks who really want to skate these big lakes and they freeze up and we get a satellite image or we get visual and it's all frozen and we go there the next day and it hasn't been that windy, but there's open water and we're all like, where did the ice go? And this is one of the places that it goes. This is called finger rafting. So basically this generally happens when ice is usually around a ½ inch. Sometimes it can happen when ice is thicker than that, but usually no more than an inch can this happen. And basically, this is where there's, say, a contraction crack in a plate or an expansion joint in a plate, and then there's wind on it, and then the ice, basically, fingers of ice will kind of go over. So where these fingers are is thicker than the ice on either side of this finger raft. So it's kind of, at one point that was double thick ice there, but the ice was still probably unsupportable. So that's one place so not only can you have big cracks that form, but you can have other things that can just kind of eat ice in wind and remove it from, and create space in the lake. And as soon as you have space in the lake, you have lots of potential problems. Anybody see anything like this who's been on the lake recently? Great. So what is this formed by?
Stacking up from the wind, blowing the ice.
Yeah. So in general, this is thin ice out here. It's this thick. This was actively happening while I was on this ice, so I had on ice wind, considering that open water because it was thin. And this was probably about 6-inch black ice here. I think this is just maybe north of Providence Island, maybe, somewhere up in there. Yeah, I think that's Stave below Providence there. And this is another thing that will eat ice. So when you have a lot of wind, this wind is blowing across these miles and miles of ice that were on the northern part of the lake. It's moving the ice, and then that ice is just stacking up on this thick ice and creating these big bands of platelets. So even when a lake is fully frozen, if you have thin ice on it, this can happen. It can then create space. When you have space, you can get those big open water leads that we were looking at. Let's see. Okay. All right. So this is on the day of the rescue on Lake Champlain. This is on the New York side. Jesse and I had gotten off the main sheet before it started moving, before the sheet that we were on started moving, and then, not long after that, we had crossed like a little open lead and noticed it was starting to move. And then we looked out, and as far as we could see all the way across the bay, the ice was just marching out. And that's when we contacted.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm glad I was not on the other side of it.
Oh, me too.
But that's where we contacted other folks at that point on that day.
Show that again.
Yeah. Yeah, let's see. How would I do that? Probably that, maybe.
Is that the Vermont side or New York side?
That's the New York side.
And you're moving east?
Nope, sorry, I'm gonna go back here. All right, maybe this will play if I do that. Nope, okay. Anybody got good ideas on how to get that video to play once I have it?
Add one more slide and then come up to it, maybe.
Okay, I'll try that. All right. Thank you. Then hopefully that'll work, maybe. There you go. Yep.
And you're looking toward Vermont?
Yep, looking across towards Shelburne at this point, yeah. And Charlotte.
How far were you out on, where were you?
Jesse and I had, oh, like how close to shore were we? Really close. Yeah, yeah. Basically like, I'll wait till the skate sound stops.
Oh, yeah, I can see it.
Yeah. So basically, like when we had noticed in the distance a lead opening, like in the big lake, which we expected, you know, Dan, I know had talked to other folks, and I had talked to other folks that night. Like we expected that this could happen that day, and I'll talk a little bit more about the specific circumstances of that. So we had noticed we had skated across from the Vermont side and we're staying close to the New York side. Just we wanted to be near shore, but we were still like slightly moving north and angling to the north, the New York side at that point. And then we noticed a lead opening in front of us. So I knew if there was a lead opening north of us, then everything at south of us was at risk, you know, as soon as that starts moving. So we got immediately to shore, and then we stepped over a small wet crack on shore, but that wet crack was what turned into a gap that went all the way down to just north of Essex.
How much time do you think that was between you seeing the lead and that opening up to that moving ice?
Well, we were probably, I mean, since we had been maintaining fairly close to, the only reason we weren't right on shore then is because there was some thinner, some 2-inch ice. So that we had gone around, which is always how this happens. You know, you're always going around something and then you're where you shouldn't be. But it was probably, we probably skated for probably 5 or 6 minutes till we got to shore. It wasn't very far, but we were skating really fast at that point. And then as soon as we stepped over that, like it looked like maybe it's moving a little bit. Anytime I see a wet crack on a big lake, I stop. Like that's like my #1 rule. If I see a wet crack on a big lake, I stop and I look at it. I want to see, like, is it moving at all? Is it moving this way? Is it moving this way? And it looked, not too much was happening, but it was just like, that could be moving. And then we turn around, talk to each other for just 30 seconds, and we look back around, and then like, all of a sudden it was picking up. And then within a couple minutes, it was moving at that rate, maybe a 1/4 mile an hour, or I don't know how fast that was moving, maybe faster. And that went on, in our estimation, for 20 or 30 minutes, although we were on the phone with people and doing other stuff, so I didn't actually have an exact count from that, but probably, I probably have record of that. I think it was probably about a half an hour that the ice moved out on that day. Let's see. And then this video here, let's see, hopefully it'll start playing. Okay. This is several days later, but this is us crossing around some thin ice on the shoreline on some of those bands of ice, which I just thought was cool. And our Henrik, who had flown over from Europe to skate with us, was on speed skates, and he had a stool and shoes with him, but he was, you know, he found places to walk around everywhere. He only had to take off his skates once. But we were envious of his stool during all the breaks. Okay. This is not the lead, but if you look closely at this, this is a lead that is opening in the lake. This was the day before, when you folks were off of Willsboro Point and I was north. I was kind of near you folks. and I took that video and scooted right to shore that day. So.
How far from the edge of that water were you? Like, does it look like you're as close as?
Yeah, I was probably pretty, it was on 3-inch ice and it was solid, so I was not worried about being, I would have walked right to the edge if I had some reason to or had to step across it. But when I got to that, it was just a little hairline. It was just a little hairline wet crack, and I stopped. And then I looked at my escape routes, I think, and then at that point, I think I texted you, Dan, or called you, maybe, at some point, and you were seeing the same thing farther down. So I knew these folks were on the ice, so I got in touch with them, like, as soon, probably, I think before I watched that get a little wider, but I had escape route plans, and there was solid ice holding in what I was on, so I wasn't super worried, or what we were on, yep. Yeah.
To go back to that question, you can get fairly close to that with open water, but if you looked at that ice wasn't fractured at all.
Yeah.
It was solid 3-inch ice, so no polygons or anything like that. You saw cracks near you back off immediately, because those polygons can easily break off. But in solid stuff like that, you can get fairly close to the edge.
Yeah, when those leads break open, they tend to be solid because they've been pulled apart under tension and they haven't been crushed together under compression. So they tend to be really clean. And these places that I was, like, these aren't necessarily safe places. Like, there was risk, like a lot of risk involved in being out there. So I don't want to, like, put it out there as an example of, like, you should be going out there trying to visualize this stuff for yourself. Like, there is calculated risk to be out there, and we're definitely hanging it out being on the lake both those days, and certainly something that we should talk about. So let's see. Before I move on from this, I'm going to talk about lake current a little bit, but any other thoughts or comments on wind, or questions from the different videos or slides we saw? Yes, Sarah.
Just one question. When you were talking about the underthinning,
Yes.
will that only happen if there's open water on the lake? Or
In general, from wave action, yeah.
so it doesn't
Yeah.
happen like on a lake that's pretty well closed in and has been closed for a while? You won't get much underthinning.
There are places where that will happen, and lake current, our next section is one of them, and so I'll get into when lake current affects that. And then I do have a video somewhere here of a gas hole, which is bringing up warm water from underneath with gas bubbles that can underthin a lake.
In wave action, that's more when there's open water?
Yeah, that's just when there's open water. Yeah, I mean that's when I've experienced it underthinning, and it's just not something that people take into account a lot. But I've seen it. I've been on ice that was this thick one day and then thinner 2 days later, in the same place.
Can you talk a little bit more about when wind switches direction? You mentioned.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So I talked to, let's see, I'm going to go back.
Other than it being really fun when you get it in both ways on.
Yes, but that's the kind of wind switching direction that we're talking about, when the whole inland sea is frozen and you have a tailwind both ways. So let's see. Yeah, so these were kind of the two slides where this water moved from here to here. So when wind switches direction, basically, so in this situation, the wind was coming from the northwest and it crunched everything together. And if that wind had stayed there for several days and we'd had several cold days, probably everything would have frozen, all these junctions would have frozen together. And that's kind of how the lake would have remained. But that wind shifted direction that night. And so then we ended up with all that open water on the other side of the lake. What we've had during this freeze up is the wind shifting from south to north with some regularity. So the connections have never been strong on this lake the whole time the main body froze. And on that day, the day before the ice rescue happened, when we were out there, the wind started from the south in the morning. It was calm in the morning, and then there was a south breeze, and then it opened stuff up. It opened up that lead picture that I showed you, and Dan saw one down near Willsboro, off of Willsboro Point, somewhere in here, I think, that day. And then the wind shifted from the north and probably closed those up. It may not have neatly closed them up, but probably closed them up again. But then that next morning, the wind shifted from the south again, and then those were weak connections. They just opened right up. And typically these are going to open up when the wind gets strong and when the ice heats up. It's always like somewhere between like 9:30 and noon this time of year that you're going to see this happen. Often because the wind is getting stronger then, but also because you're getting expansion cracking, which is weakening whatever pore junctions were frozen the night before. So being on the ice really early is important on those questionable days. One, because it tends to be calm, and two, because it's before those expansion cracks have then weakened all of these little connections that were in here that froze the night before. They might just pop apart and weaken due to expansion, and then the wind can very easily move sheets of ice. Does that make sense? So I really pay attention to like your weather history and how often the wind has been shifting if you have questions. Like I think that's just, you know, if it's been shifting a lot and the lake isn't completely frozen, you're at much greater risk because all your connections are going to be weak in between your plates. That was a really good question. Thank you.
Evan, can we talk about numbers for the wind speed?
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember what the wind speed was on that day where that big plate moved. Are we talking high single digits, or are we talking teens?
Yeah. Yeah, it was like high single digits. Like when Jesse and I started skating back, we were skating into a headwind, but it wasn't much of one. It was probably under 10, you know, and it had just recently built to that, like within the last hour.
So it seems like the effect on the ice can be greater than the effect on you. Like,
oh yeah.
Like,
yeah.
Something that's not a big deal to skate into can still have a big impact on the
yes.
lake itself. Yeah,
just think of a ship. That's the thing with a big lake. Think of a ship with all of its sails unfurled in a 4-knot wind.
A lot of friction.
Yeah. Kind of the time on the ice where I was most at risk was several years ago. The first time I ever skated with Jesse Stevens, who was in that first picture, on Sebago Lake, on the main body of Sebago, which hadn't frozen for several years. It had been reported to be frozen all the way across. Someone had taken like a drone picture, had an aerial picture that didn't show the whole lake, but it would look like it was all frozen and been reported from several shorelines and was reported at 2.5 inches. So Jesse and I arrived on a windless morning at 6 a.m. and started skating the shoreline of that lake. And we stayed religiously next to the shore, the old ice edge, and then we got around the lake, and there was just one bay in between some islands. It was pretty sizable that was open, and so we had to make a decision. Do we turn back, or do we just cross this bay on the ice? Everything's been the same. It's been 2 to 2.5 inches the whole time. And so at that point, we elected to cross the bay. Probably about 25 minutes before that, we had crossed a wet crack that was probably 6 inches. Hadn't really taken note of it. We had crossed a few other wet cracks earlier, but then we crossed. We went around this. Let's see. I'll draw this on here just because I think this is interesting because it's the wind situation is. I'm going to put this in the middle so most people have a chance of seeing it. Essentially, Sebago Lake is a huge circle. It's also 400 something feet deep, and it has very little topography around it. So it tends to be one of the last lakes to freeze. Like Sebago Lake froze up at the same time as most of the rest of Champlain froze up, even though it's a much smaller lake. It doesn't have topography, it's round, so it can get wind from any direction, never has protection anywhere. So it's rare, it takes a long time for it to freeze. So basically, like, we'd started here, we'd skated all the way around, and then this little cutout here, it wasn't even nearly that big in reference to the lake, but we basically came across a bay where there was open water. And so the smart move would have been to turn around then, and then somewhere back in here, we had crossed just a small wet crack. It wasn't the first wet crack we had crossed. We'd crossed a couple in here. None of them were moving. And so we decided, oh, well, we're just gonna skate around this because we can actually see the ice. We could see the ice going all the way to shore over up here. We did that, and then we got to right about here on the lake, and then the ice that was 2 inches went to about 1 3/8 inches to 1.5 inches. And we're still, you know, a distance from shore. And so this was kind of the plate that was thinner there. And we're like, well, we don't want to cross that. And in the distance, we could hear a sound, but I didn't really identify what that sound was at that point because I hadn't been in that situation before. Thought, well, maybe it's a really populated lake. It was some sort of construction or something like that. But we could hear this clacking sound in the distance because it was almost perfectly still out. There was like a barely perceptible wind that was starting because now it was kind of probably 10 in the morning. But it was, you know, under 5 miles an hour for sure. Just very perceptible. Like when we decided at this point, okay, we're going to skate back because we could also see like a big lead in the main lake out here. And so it was kind of going into there. And so we're like, well, we can't cross that. So we're going to go back. So we went back. We got back to that crack, and it was probably about 40 feet wide. And this shoreline had now opened up all the way to there. It wasn't very far to shore, but that was before I was wearing a dry suit regularly. And so then we were like, okay. And that's Jesse hadn't done a lot of big lake skating, and that was when I informed him, like, we're probably in trouble here. Like, we need to be thinking like we're in trouble, not just like we need to find another way out. And so at that point, we hadn't really explored out into the lake at all. So we skated around, we skated out into the lake, and then we saw this lead, and then way in the distance, we saw another lead like this out here, and we're like, that's not an option. And so then we skated back to here, but we skated back to there, and it just, we were on that thick ice edge, but like the shoreline, in retrospect, appeared quite a bit closer from where we had started. But it didn't really register. To me, it just registered as wrong. Like, this doesn't feel like we were here before. I'm pretty sure this is where we were on the edge where we stopped. I can see our skate tracks, but shore is now here. You know, like shore is that much closer, like, so that it was pretty close. And then, so we tested that 1 3/8 or 1.5 inch ice, and we tested it this was a cloudy day as well. And we tested it to see if it would support us. And indeed, it did support us. And so we decided, having all of our options shut off in all other directions, that we were going to double pole across this ice. Which in retrospect we didn't have to do, but we still didn't really understand what was happening. And so we did, we double poled across. It was scary. We made it to shore. I remember like falling on the big plate pile on shore, and it's just coming right in, not at this, but much slower than the speed we saw the ice moving out here, but it's just coming in and stacking up. And I remember falling on that pile and looking at this beech sapling right next to me with the leaves still on it, and the leaves were just dead still. You know, that's how light the wind was. It wasn't fluttering a leaf, but there was definitely a little bit of wind. So in retrospect, we could have just stayed here and ended up on shore. In that
video?
What's that?
I saw that video.
Yeah, I couldn't find it somewhere. I looked through all my stuff, but yeah. Yeah. So that was a situation where it's probably a 3 mile an hour wind and we were on thin ice. We were, it was just a bunch of like inexperienced decisions that we had made. But fortunately, we were both like really proactive people and understood our environment well enough to kind of make decisions to get ourselves out of it. But it was a big part of my learning process, and it's why I absorb every wet crack that I cross now, and why Jesse upped his safety gear game and stuff like that. Yep.
So when you first hit that 1 3/8 or 1
Yeah.
1/2 inch, what clued you into that was thinner? Was it sound, or were you poking? Or
It was just a junction. It was just like any junction that we would normally test. It didn't look a lot different, but it was just, we're testing a boundary like we normally would anytime we're skating. We tested that boundary and it was thin. And there was a little bit of rubble out off of it, and where the rubble was thicker and you could get out on the rubble. And that's one thing I didn't mention, that when we double pulled across it, there were interspersed like little fields of rubble, and those were all thicker. So they were like little islands. So when we decided to double pull across this, we had some little islands that we knew would support us better, but still would have been a long, choppy swim in. But we were close enough to shore at that point that, we both felt, well, if we have to chop our way through this to get in, we could. But yeah, wasn't a great situation. But I think that a great question about wind and like how little wind is required. Yes.
This might be a good time for a little break.
Perfect.
Maybe a
Let's do it.
shorter one, because this
Yeah.
is so interesting.
Yeah. No,
I want to give Evan a little break.
this is a great time. And any last questions on this subject? Because that last question was a great one. So. All right, break time. So I think it's important to mention that every large lake is going to have current. Some lakes have like steady known currents that stay similar for a lot of the year. And then some lakes will have currents based on different situations that are happening on the lake. So it's not something that's always a static situation in terms of lake current. Lake Champlain is one of those lakes that I don't really know a lot about the current in Champlain. I know where it is and where it isn't, but there's a whole bevy of knowledge that I don't have about how the current works on Lake Champlain. But to my knowledge, Lake Champlain is a lake that has pretty steady current in certain locations, and it's always predictable. I think one of the big things about the lake is because it's so big, it has many good-sized rivers that flow into it. More on the Vermont side than the New York side, and I'm more familiar with the current patterns on the Vermont side. But we have the Missisquoi River up here, which flows up into Missisquoi Bay. And then we have the Lamoille and the Winooski down in here, and they're all good-sized rivers, particularly if we get rainstorms and such. And so those are introducing current into the lake, and that force has to go somewhere. In my experience, like where the Lamoille comes out here. I just haven't noticed a lot of persistent hazards at that point where it's coming out into the inland sea there, or outer Mallett's Bay properly. Likewise, I haven't spent a lot of time around the Winooski because it's on the broad lake there. But I do know the Missisquoi River here, generally the first big part of the lake to freeze will sometimes be south of the bridge, but more often Missisquoi Bay will freeze before south of the bridge. There's been better reporting recently I find, in the past many years, it's just frozen rough almost every time. But when people are looking for ice in Burlington, it's often been frozen for some time. I've come up to skate and I've realized, oh, there's a foot thick ice up on Missisquoi Bay. I think there's a fellow named Ben, I don't know if he's here, but he reports from up there now and has given us some great reports. And with satellite, in the last 5 years, with satellite being something that we're all using more, we get to see. But anyways, the Missisquoi River comes in up here, and this is a very shallow bay. We can see that by the color. Anybody who's ever been up in this area, there's almost always open water here by the bridge up in that area. And then the coming down into the gut here in the middle of that, it opens up, it'll open up again this season probably if it gets warm. And then coming out of that area there. So that's a current coming into the lake, and then once it gets out into the lake here, besides for just this little area here, I don't particularly notice anything particular about persistent problems that it creates. But until it gets there are problems all along the way, especially where the lake narrows, because that current seems to be moving right down through there. It's not going into the inland sea per se. And then, Dan and other folks here are more experts on south of the bridge, is very shallow and has very significant current. So that opens up, a lot, right?
Yeah, but then there's like off the 5 Mile Point, right, on the Vermont side by the paper mill in Ticonderoga. That's
Yeah.
always a trouble spot.
Yeah. Is the lake shallow at that spot? I've always wondered about that spot because it is wide. It's not the most narrow part down there, but it tends to always be open there. And then you have East Creek comes in right there too, right? Yeah. So, and then once you get really far south where it's really more of like closer to a river down there, that section opens up coming out of Whitehall quite a bit down there. So you've got this current flowing through, and then we've got north of the bridge here, which is deeper, but not as deep as, and then it gets kind of deeper in the Narrows, and then the deepest part of the lake, I believe, is right in here. Yes.
I can tell you right off of Scotch Bonnet, just south of Basin Harbor,
Yes.
the little rock piece there, it's called Scotch Bonnet, a little buoy there.
Yep.
That is about a 2.5 knot current going north.
Okay.
Depending on where the rain's coming in and the inflow.
Yeah.
That baby moves right along right.
Yeah, so that buoy will be bent over a bit when it's calm. And this would be a natural choke point when the river is still or the lake is still relatively shallow here, going into a constriction. It does get deeper in there. And I assume there is current in here, but it probably dissipates some once you get north of Split Rock and the lake opens up. But there still is water moving from this end of the lake to that end of the lake. So then when you hit the islands, shallows around Burlington and stuff, like there's always persistent open water near Juniper Island. Like what I've noticed when the lake is trying to freeze, it's probably also due to wind and stuff too. But so anyways, there is current that exists. I don't really know to the extent that is under thinning ice. There probably are situations where it's under thinning ice. And the reason current under thins ice is not because current is inherently warm, but because it creates turbulence and it's bringing up warmer water, 38-degree water from down below and bringing it up to the surface. So that's why current is a problem, because it's bringing up that denser 38-degree water, bringing it up and mixing that in and bringing it to the bottom of the ice. I do know that on many years, the Narrows will freeze and blow out several times, and current probably has something to do with keeping that ice thin after it freezes. And often the Narrows will freeze before Westport and definitely before Essex freezes. And so whenever the Narrows are frozen on their own, they're a really dangerous place to be just because of wind and because of current, because that ice almost always disappears until it freezes. It usually freezes in a loop like this, with Westport being the last place to freeze. But once it freezes around, then the Narrows are a lot more secure. But oftentimes the Narrows are frozen, but Westport is open. But there is strong ice kind of right in, strong ice edge in there. So current's an issue. I think like in terms of like the recent events that happened, current, certainly could have played a part in it, but I think relative to the wind, it has marginal effects. It has the marginal effects of maybe keeping water open in places, of when the wind blows, giving it a little extra boost to move ice if the wind is actually blowing in the direction of the current, which it is if it's blowing south. And so these are just really good things to pay attention to on a big lake because it's such a vast body of water, you don't expect current to be a factor in it. So it's just something to pay attention to out there. And I can't say that I really properly understand how much current has affected our recent situations that have happened or what's going on in here. But it's something to pay attention to and know that it exists. So that's going to be at inflows, and it's also going to be at outflows. Where the Richelieu River leaves up there, that is going to open and close many times over the course of a season generally because there's significant current. Once you get right in here, there tends to be significant current and then going down into the Richelieu, in my experience. And this area in here always is like, takes a lot longer to freeze than you might think, and that's probably due to current as well. And that's just having that marginal effect when, really like when you needed 2 still nights and you got 1.5, that current may have been the difference between it making it the ice catching or not. And if it's really cold, the current doesn't matter as much because it's just gonna freeze the ice thick. But when it warms up again, it's gonna be a problem. So the other thing that I'm really familiar with on Lake Winnipesaukee is when the lake is partially frozen, and I've observed it, there's a lot of current on Lake Winnipesaukee, and it's a much different situation with this. Like the rivers that flow into it are small, the river that flows out of it's actually pretty small. Lake Winnipesaukee really kind of is its watershed. That's got some watershed around it, but not a lot. It's way different than Lake Champlain. But within the lake, because it has big shallow areas and big deep areas, and there's different temperatures, especially when the lake is open, temperature differential is what moves air, what creates wind, and what creates current in the ocean. That's because of temperature differentials. So when a lake is half open, it tends to accelerate current because you might have cold water sinking into where there is some warm water. Warm water overtopping cold water, and warm water could be just warmed on a sunny day when it's still and open. That surface of that water is warm. So something to pay attention to. And there are, particularly in places I don't notice it as much on Lake Champlain, but on Lake Winnipesaukee has lots of shallow areas, lots of island chains, and you can skate up to the edges of these islands where they join and just watch like a 1 or 2 mile an hour current just stream through that little open area. And there's no rivers around or anything like that. So just knowing once you get a large body of water, current is going to happen because temperature differential is going to happen. And then we've got lake floor topography. And so that will be reefs, of which there are many in Lake Champlain. So a reef is rocks that are underwater. And if there is current, that current, which is moving along, is going to then be forced up to the surface with that warmer water that's underneath the surface is going to be pushed right up to the top. So the first time I ever properly went swimming, like 13 years into my skating career, that was a situation on Lake Winnipesaukee where there was a huge boulder, it was clear ice, and there was just a 30-foot swath of thin ice sitting over this boulder where the current had pushed up water over it. But besides that, we were on like 3-inch ice, and that was a perfectly clear, beautiful day. So reefs, boulders, and then deep spots on the lake, channels, rapid depth change. These are all things that are going to affect current slowing or speeding up. And let's see, I've got a few slides here. Oh, yes.
Quick on the last thing, do you actually look at bathymetry of your lakes you skate on?
I usually do in retrospect, right? Like if I'm trying to figure out a problem, that then like if I'm trying to sort out a problem, but like as I said, like this is like you're going to kind of know how deep they are by watching which lakes freeze and which lakes don't, and which is the last part to freeze on when you've had properly still nights, but it's still not frozen because the water cycle hasn't happened yet, which is why, you know, like the south of the bridge can freeze in Missisquoi Bay will freeze months on winters that the Broad Lake freezes. Those will be frozen months before that because the water cycle hasn't happened. So yes, I do, but oftentimes, you know, like I generally no, but then if there's a specific issue or problem, in that case on Lake Winnipesaukee, when I skate over that thin spot over the boulder, I just could go and inspect it, and it was like a flat bottom with a huge boulder that you could look right down and see, and no real other explanation. We actually weren't close to, there was islands ahead of us, so it was a place that current might have been moving through, but not where it would have been at its most intense. But that boulder was intensifying the current in that particular spot. And freezing temperatures had been more marginal those last few nights, so that ice was thin, but had been there for a while. So, but it hadn't been like negative temperatures. It had been more like 15 degrees, 20 degrees for slowly thickening the ice. But that wasn't competing with that current well enough to thicken that area. Any other thoughts about current? Cool. I think it's something for us to think about, to check out the obvious places, not get hung up on too much, because generally wind is going to be our bigger problem on these big bodies of water. But the current is going to be that marginal force that makes the wind be more damaging because there's thin ice in places you wouldn't expect. Okay. So this is just kind of like, we've talked about this a lot, but just a general kind of like safety thing, that the size of your body of water really matters. And we've talked about current, we've talked about wind, but what I would like to talk about is safety. So how does size affect like our safety out on the water?
Well, distance to shore.
Yeah, so distance to shore, and that's kind of like that's a really big thing. Why does that matter to us?
Can be a long way to swim.
Okay, yeah. Ideally, we're not doing any distance swimming, but if things have gone really wrong at that point. But yes, it means like if you're in a small lake and a plate blows off and you're floating on it, chances are it's going to hit the other shore. If a plate blows off into the Broad Lake on Champlain, it's probably going to break up while you're on it. It's most likely going to be a fatality, if there's really strong wind, because the chance of rescue getting to you is pretty small in that situation, but possible. So, yes, what are the reasons? How does being far out there affect us?
Just getting people off ice, and as ice is hard, and the number of things that could go wrong are, exponential. And so,
Yeah.
how do you get someone who's got a fracture or something? How do you stabilize them and get them treatment while getting emergency services type thing?
Yeah. So if you have an injury, injuries are common for us out there. Anybody who's been skating any period of time, we know that people have significant injuries on the ice, and particularly since we're all getting older, the population of people on the ice skews older, so bones break more easily as we age. So that's really something to keep in mind in terms of we have plans in the group that I skate with to deal with that, but something for folks to consider carrying is a small tarp or something like that, which you can use to slide somebody across the ice so those are kind of things you'll consider when you're farther out on the ice. I think the other thing is is thin ice. If you're injured or something happens, like the rescue that occurred the other day, those skaters were kind of prepared, knew what they were doing on thick ice. There was water, a boat could come up to them. But if something happened and they needed to be rescued and they were 2 miles out on 2-inch ice, there's not a lot of equipment. I think like the Coast Guard that has an airboat, but the rescue services are not really trained for that. And for them to get there in that distance is going to take hours probably for them to figure out how they're going to do it. There may be places in the world where they've got all the right equipment and the training to do that, but typically they're not trained and they're not going to be ice that's not supportable. We've all seen the videos of fire departments rescuing dogs, but they're not going to crawl across the ice without equipment for 2 miles, or if they do, it's going to be a big production for them to get to that point. So just knowing that you're very far from rescue, actually, if you're out on thin ice. If you're out on thick ice, you're a lot closer to rescue. So something we should be thinking of in our communities is not only being in parties that we feel comfortable with when we're out there on big ice, having some medical training, but also having people we can call close, just having those people we can call who could also come out and help you. Like they get in their car, put on their dry suit, and they get some people together. But that's not an unlikely scenario that might be needed someday, depending on the situation. So obviously helicopter rescue is possible, but also very hard on thin ice because they're going to treat it like open water. So I think that's just something we need to keep in mind in terms of like being out on a big lake. That it's really a serious situation, and especially on thin ice. I mentioned it, and then Tom told the accurate story on the listserv of the folks who are ice fishing down in I think there was 2 foot thick ice right down here in Essex. Somewhere up here, the lake was open, and this was in 1988. A big unexpected wind came out that was about 70 miles an hour, and blew that thick ice with 25 people, men, women, and children, out into the lake. And it was too high of a wind to fly helicopters in, so the helicopter pilots who rescued were not required, even though they were on duty to do that. They elected to go and rescue those folks. And in shifts, starting with the children, then the women, and then the men, they were able to rescue everybody in 70-mile-an-hour winds. But the last people were way out here on a piece of ice. So that's just kind of like a stark reminder. That was a similar situation that happened the other day. There was a lot of factors that were in play, and the reason why we were taking the risk of being out there that were in play that precluded that wholesale ice clearing that happened that day, where it just floated out. And I'll talk about that in a little bit.
Can I ask as well?
Yeah.
I mean, it seems like there's also parts of the lake that are inaccessible for land-based emergency services. So if you're on the New York side, there's parts there that they couldn't get to and be able to see as easily as folks in Chittenden County. And a lot, in this whole area, your rescue's coming from the Vermont side, most likely, or unless it's out of Westport or something. Yeah, and this is like the most populated lake in our region. A lot of skaters, and if you're skating over in Maine, and a lot of places we skate, the lakes are really remote, and so there's no rescue service anywhere. And some of them, there's one boat ramp with a partially plowed road to access an enormous lake. So just stuff to keep in mind out there. Okay. Is that the end there? No. I guess that's the end there of that part. Hold on, let me think I've got some more. There we go. All right. So I wanted to talk a little bit about expansion and contraction cracks because I've mentioned them before. And what are the circumstances where I've mentioned previously in this discussion about why we need to pay attention to expansion and contraction cracks in relationship to other forces?
They can widen.
Yeah, they can widen. And then when we were talking about like the wind shifting directions, I talked about how those junctions are weak. And then it tends to always be late morning when you start to have leads form and ice break up. It's because that expansion, one of the reasons is the wind is picked up, but the other major reason is all those junctions have weakened, and those contraction cracks from the night before that maybe then froze shut again, or expansion cracks that happened that morning open those cracks up.
And so when you see cracks in a lake, they're always like a combination. They initially start either as an expansion crack or a contraction crack, but then they become a combination. This crack here is a contraction crack. And typically, if you've ever seen those beautiful serpentine cracks, those are contraction cracks where the ice is cooling at different temperatures and creates these kind of curved cracks. But if it cools at it perfectly, if everything cools equally, oftentimes this crack will be really straight, or a subtle arc.
When you have a light dust and snow like this,
Mhm.
does it reduce the likelihood of the expansion, the melting, because you get the reflection?
Yeah.
Generally?
Yeah, it reduces both. Yeah. So snow cover can really keep lakes stable for a while, and that's why I was mentioning that circumstance where it's been cloudy and snow covered, then the snow blew off, and the ice is already pretty thick. Even though there's just been light snow cover, it's been able to thicken. But then that day, the sun hits it, and everything goes crazy. I think it's just important to know about these and that they're happening pretty much every day unless it's cloudy and temperature stays stable from day to night, and they're always creating subtle weaknesses in the ice. And they also, particularly expansion cracks, I don't have a lot of good, I didn't find a lot of good pictures, but they can be real clues as to those pictures I showed you earlier before the pressure ridge was going to form, like that with all those cracks, or you can see spiral cracks in the ice, and those are all expansion cracks. So you can see that tortured look of this really high pressured ice. And if those are happening while you're on the ice, pressure ridges are going to be occurring somewhere. So I don't think we need to spend too long on this. Does anybody have any more questions?
You mentioned the way that the tortured compression ice looks.
Yes.
What you haven't mentioned is sound.
Yes. Okay, so generally right before, and I found a great video last minute, but I don't have it on here because I do have one of it. But generally right before a crack goes, it's like a ticking sound, like tick, 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 tick. Generally that's the sound that I've heard right before it. You'll hear the big booms, you'll hear all that kind of stuff, but if you're near a place that is gonna go, it's like this ticking of a clock, like a tick, and kind of little crackly sound. So if you hear a massive, and then you can hear a massive boom of when it actually goes on the ice, And that's the kind of thing, if you're on questionable ice and you're worried about the wind direction and you're worried about like a sheet of ice blowing off and you start to hear booming, then okay, some big stuff has started to move out there, and I need to be on extra high alert. All right, so I want to talk a little bit here about reservoirs. We have a lot of reservoirs that we skate on, in Vermont and all over New England. Major issue is changing water levels, and what that affects is reef hazards, so things that are underwater. That are, but maybe close to the surface, and then shoreline hazards. So whether that be rocks or other shallow areas near the surface. Typically, when reservoirs go up and down, they're going to create moats. This is a picture of Moore Reservoir, which is in Vermont and New Hampshire. This is the New Hampshire side. So you can see right up here, at one point not long ago in this picture, and that's probably, I would estimate probably 7 or 8 vertical feet there. This reservoir has dropped 7 or 8 vertical feet. In the process of doing that, this has probably dropped and then come up a little bit again. That's what this looks like to me, and then created this moat. And this can happen during the day, so you can very easily get on the ice, show up back at your takeout, and then you're gonna have a moat there. That's gonna be maybe impossible to cross in that location. In my experience, there's always some place to cross a moat, like there's always some place to cross a pressure ridge. You're usually going to find something, but it is usually not where you want to cross it. And I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind. People sometimes make some really poor decisions just because they can't go exactly where they want to go. And you need to kind of just keep your mind open. Like, I'm on this ice. My priority is to get off this ice. If I'm inconvenienced by having to walk a long way or call a friend, that's a much better option than swimming, crossing thin ice, or doing something that's going to put yourself more at risk. So that's a major thing to consider is moats, and then areas if you do have current in a reservoir, which is quite common, and then the reservoir level drops, and let's say you have a shallow reef underneath, and then that's 20 feet down, but then the reservoir drops 15 feet. Now that reef is going to create an ice thinning potential because that current is going to be driven up over the reef and under thin the ice. And as well as, one thing that people are always concerned about reservoirs is that like the water's going to drop out and they're going to be skating across ice with nothing underneath it. And that's not how ice works. When ice is on water and the water level drops, the ice, which is also a fluid, is going to stick right to that ice surface. The only place it will not is right on the shoreline if it gets held up on rocks or things like that. So definitely plenty of chances to fall if there's a bunch of rocks and you may be on, say, 3-inch ice that's bridged over rocks and you're walking down with your traction on and then you fall through that. But usually that's more of an inconvenience and not a major hazard. But in the general public, oftentimes the general public thinks that like reservoirs are really dangerous to skate on or to be on because the water level goes up and down and then there's like, it's just hollow under there and then you fall through. But that's, I can't tell you how many times I've heard that. It's not that it's not true. I mean, they are more dangerous, but it's because the shoreline is always weak. And with the shoreline that was great one day, now people are falling through trying to get on the ice the next day, or they drove their ATV on one day and then they drove right into the water the next day, or a couple days later. So that is a hazard. It tends to be on the shoreline or over reefs. Any other questions or thoughts about reservoirs? And if you go around and look at like most of the bodies of water in New England, like most of them have some sort of dam on them. Lake Champlain's kind of an exception, but most of they do have dams. Sometimes those dams are just to like raise the water level for water storage reasons or whatever, but sometimes there are hydro things or they are controlling water level. Not every dam is changing the water level on the lake, but most lakes do have dams, and sometimes they're working on dams, and water levels will change because of that.
Somebody's phone is
That's mine, I apologize.
All right, let's see. See if we can get this guy to go here.
Just one thing on reservoirs.
Yeah.
A local reservoir, one of the most dangerous things is actually getting in and out because there's usually ice that slows down.
Yeah.
The last 20 feet as the water, so it's like just getting to the reservoir is the most concussion hazardous thing that I've seen skating. Really.
Yeah, and people are often reticent to stop and put on traction just for that 20 feet and stop and put on traction. Yeah. Or if you're comfortable, put on your skates. Skates are great traction and just sidestep down. You think they're not, I mean, people laugh, but like they're much better than being on your boots. You know, you just don't want to put them on and point your way down, but you can step down.
It's usually pretty easy to, sometimes you can slide down, but you can't slide up.
Yes, yes.
Actually, we often bring a sled.
So this is actually Waterbury Reservoir up on the north end, and so what's happening here? Yeah, has anybody here ever skated on Waterbury Reservoir? Yeah, have you seen these up there? They're on the north end, and there's a lot of them. You know, I assume there's a lot of buried material, but there are gas holes on Lake Champlain. I think Bob mapped. He did a bunch of mapping inspired by Swedish ice mapping of where, and so if you look on his website there, Bob Dill's Lake Ice website, there is some maps of where there are persistent gas holes on Lake Champlain.
Why on this reservoir are there many of them?
Well, they're more typical on reservoirs just because often in this was just a wooded valley, right? And then they dammed it up at one point, and then at some point there was a bunch of debris left. It got sediment over it, and then for the last 50 years or however long, it's been slowly decomposing. So on the Connecticut River above like the Wilder Dam, there's insane gas holes. Like there's a whole section of ice that's just full of methane holes like this. And sometimes they're frozen over because it's been cold enough, but they always tend to open up again. And so they're kind of like wind holes, and they sneak right up on you. All right, I talked a little bit about this before in terms of distance from rescue and thin ice rescue. And then just knowing that, you know, on Lake Champlain, you're in a more populated area with more professionalized rescue services. There are a lot of them. I believe there was probably 7 or 8 different agencies that reacted, and that's how it's supposed to work. And they all actually appreciate these experiences because they're training for them. So they're going to come out with their equipment and hope to use it because that's what they train for. But there just are a lot of places where there might not be a professional rescue service, or that it'll just be the fire department, and maybe they'll be belligerent and not helpful. That happens sometimes. Most of the time they're really helpful, but if people who are not trained are afraid in that situation because they don't want to see someone die, and so their fear sometimes gets transferred into anger at you, and I've definitely seen that happen to people out there. It's not common, but it's just important to know and be able to diffuse that and do your best to do that. Because if someone's angry at you in that situation, they're afraid. You know, they're afraid of not being good enough, of not being able to rescue you, of not knowing what to do. And so in properly trained rescue services, like I've been on rescue teams, and I've never ever experienced a hint of resentment from anybody on those teams when they've been called out in the middle of the night. Like that's their job, that's what they're trained to do, and they just tend not to be resentful of that, even if someone has made a poor choice. You know, they don't want people to make poor choices, but you know, generally a well-trained rescue team is going to be happy to help you. Any other questions about this topic here? I think we talked about it a bit before. So. Okay, yeah, I've got it in the car, so I can open it up. Heidi was just rifling through it for my traction, which I think she put back in, so hopefully everything's in there. Okay, so this is a big part of safety that I wanted to cover here, and this is pre-trip planning. And so whenever I go out, it tends to be my wife Heidi. I tell her generally where I'm going in my general plan, which she knows is always going to change, but at least she's got like, and if I do make a major change, I tend to text her. And then the group of people I'm with as well, you know, so there's all those different safety features. But in general, having a start and an end is a good idea just to discuss with your group before you go out. Like, what's our general plan? Just so people have that, everybody has that in mind, because like we can all get a little bit distracted out there, and people sometimes don't even realize what the general plan is, what's going on, when we need to be back by, because everything's just so cool. Setting up shuttles, which is something that we do frequently. Like when I did a big skate, I think it was a couple days after that rescue happened, when we had good conditions based on timing of the day, and we set up a shuttle vehicle because we knew there was no way we were going to go back to Charlotte at the end of that skate. And that ice did indeed move some that day. I don't know how much it moved, but we were there when it was calm in the morning and out of that area before the wind picked up and before it got warm. But we set a shuttle because we knew going back to the car was probably not going to be an option. Which, yeah, I'll talk about that a little bit. But local rescue services, just having that information. I don't always have their numbers written down. I always have the phone charged and a battery backup for it. And I just generally kind of know the area I'm in the towns. But since I travel a skate, sometimes I don't always look at this information. But if you're always skating on Lake Champlain, it'd be a good idea to have that info with you if you don't think you're going to have it. You know, it'll just make it easier for you to make that call if you need to.
Is that different than 911?
Yeah, I mean, when I've worked professionally as an outdoor leader, I have contacted rescue agencies directly just to expedite things, but then also called 911 and let them know. So I don't know. I guess I can't really answer that question for you, but 911 will do it, but alerting the people who know exactly what to do to get mobilizing 20 minutes before that goes through the system, which may take a while depending. If I was on thin ice on Lake Champlain, I want to call whatever rescue service it was had that airboat that was parked in the road. I don't know. Hey, John, do you know whose airboat that was?
State troopers.
All right, call the state troopers. And then and then bailout points. Like I always have that. That's always in my mind if I'm on a big lake is like, where am I going to bail out if this goes wrong? Where are we going to go to shore? Where are we going to try to get an Uber from? How, knowing that, like if I get stuck on the lake, what does that look on that side of the lake? What does that look like, and have a plan for it? Because that's going to make me make a much better decision and be willing to be stuck on that side of the lake and stay on shore rather than trying to go back across unsafe ice because my car's over here. So just having bailout points and plans is really important on bigger skates, on bigger lakes. Let's see, longer trips on big lakes. I've kind of talked about this, but I put in an enormous amount of research when I'm skating on big lakes. It's like an enormous amount of time that I spend in. Some of it, I'm not like I'm doing other things, but I'm paying attention to the weather history for a couple weeks beforehand. Any satellite data, any verbal information I've gotten, for instance, on that day the ice blew out, I had verbal information from Dan and then Joe that there was a big, not only the lead that I saw farther up the lake, but there was a lead off of Willsboro Point. So I knew that was just a weak spot that next day was going to be weak again. And that was I just had that in my head as verbal information. Weather history, and then knowing what the weather is going to be that day. And that weather history is important, Kate, from your question earlier of that wind direction change. Like, has this wind been shifting back and forth, or has it been steady out of the north for a week? That's going to kind of change my assessment of what's happening with the ice pack. So there's a lot to go out, and this is particularly for longer trips. A lot of this information is really appropriate for just skating on Letty Beach alone, right? It's open to the big lake. But then some of this information here is more for doing those longer skates, which are kind of like those lifetime dream skates for people to do a 25 or a 30 mile skate on beautiful ice on a big lake. If you've been skating a while, you've probably been dreaming about that if you haven't done it yet. And then gear check. I kind of solve this by going with generally on the more difficult skates with a set group of people who I trust and are all very high skilled. And so I tend not to go in large parties or with folks that I have reservations about on skates where I'm worried about things happening because I've done all this research and I know, yep, something could happen out here. So, but just if you're joining up with people, just doing a gear check. Does that mean you send someone back because their backpack is incomplete? Maybe you don't, but you know that they don't really have a full change of clothes in there. They've got obviously you want them to have all the proper safety gear, but maybe they're partially prepared, but we've got 3 other fully prepared people in this group, and we just know that we're going to fill in for them if they need it. But just knowing what people have with them so that you know what your resources are. Any questions or thoughts on this? Yeah.
Just one thing, and that is, if you're going to go out with a group, it's incumbent upon you to be prepared, because you put everybody at risk.
Yeah.
You put yourself at risk, you put your comrades at risk. If you don't have all the gear, ask. And people carry extras, extra pads, extra poles, extra skates. So if you can't outfit yourself properly, completely, ask the group, and chances are you can be filled in. But it's pretty important to have the gear and know how to use it.
Yeah, and I think like that's kind of like why we're here. It's like why I'm here, you know. And it's not that I think necessarily all of you folks need to know about this, but just to hopefully inspire people to do a little bit more educating, because often we're bringing other people onto the ice and just not being afraid to say, hey, this is the kind of stuff you should have. I can lend it to you. This is a place you can get it. But just like spreading this information so that we have, in general, a more prepared and educated population out on the ice. We're always going to have hockey skaters who go out too far with no gear and stuff like that, or people who just get Nordic skates. They just heard about it and they just go for it. That's always going to happen. That's never going to stop. But once you get a percentage of a community that knows what to do and are willing to spread education, then the whole culture can change. And I've watched it happen in so many sports that I've been involved in. And you know, I've talked to and know a lot about other skating cultures in other parts of the country, and we have one of the best, most prepared, healthiest skating cultures here in Vermont, by far. And that's due to a lot of work by people who came long before me, who really put a lot of time into education to make sure that there was enough people out there. So if you're out on a lake on a given day, you're going to run into somebody who knows what they're doing. And then slowly you're going to be like, oh yeah, maybe that's a good idea to wear a helmet, to have a backpack with me, that kind of stuff. I mean, you laugh, but I mean, people don't wear, you know, there's huge parts of the population, and especially in other parts of the country, that don't wear helmets, that don't wear ice picks, that are still going out on long skates with hockey sticks as their only protection. And even educators who are not, you know, they're educating the public, but also not properly prepared themselves, which is kind of worst case scenario, because that kind of role modeling's not great. Great. All right, so I wanted to talk a little bit about ice thickness. I've mentioned it a lot, but I think it deserves its own kind of category here. When I think about a big lake, and I think about this particularly in terms of like a massive wind event on a completely frozen big lake, like in general, in my observation, and other folks can counter me if you've seen different things happen, when there's nothing open, I've seen ice that's less than 5 inches blow out. Like I've seen just lakes open up when they've got 4 inches of ice on them in a 50-mile-an-hour windstorm, when, to my knowledge, it was frozen wall to wall. There was enough force and enough action to create one weak spot, and then you can have a lake clear on you. So that's why high winds are really dangerous under any conditions, but particularly if you're under 5-inch ice. But probably many of us have been out on the inland sea recently in the last few years with 8 or 10 inches of ice, and the wind gets up to 25 miles an hour, but it's fully frozen, it's been skated for weeks, and we kind of know that's okay. But if that same inland sea at 3 inches of ice with 25 mile an hour wind, even if you know it's fully frozen, you've seen the satellite pictures, you know when it froze, it's a much more dangerous situation than if you've got 8 or 10 inches of ice. So just really acknowledging like that, the wind in relation to ice thickness, and then obviously what we've talked about clearing, where particularly when ice is below 2 inches, it clears really easily. It's definitely going to clear at 3 inches under, but it's going to take more wind. And then at 4 inches, it can still clear. And you saw those huge blocks up on shore that were 8 inches thick. When you have 5-foot lakes, waves coming down Champlain, it's going to clear 8-inch ice too, under certain circumstances. And then just, it doesn't mean that thick ice, I wanted to reiterate that thick ice is not inherently stable. Great, so open water. I think this is like, whenever like I post a picture or a video or something, like if people see me skating next to open water, like that's when everybody's the most nervous. When, to me, like when there's open water, like I know. You know, I got ice here, I got water here, and I'm kind of like, that it's a known thing, and I'm most nervous when I don't know, when I can't see, when I'm going out on conditions where a lake has been resurfaced with many thicknesses of ice, and there are no longer proper boundaries to read because it rained, it snowed, and then maybe rained on a lake that had 1-inch ice, 5-inch ice, 2-inch ice, and then that next day I don't know, I can't read anything. But open water, we've talked a lot about the dangers on big lakes with kind of ice shelves coming off with off-ice wind, wave under thinning, wave bludgeoning, and that's with on-ice wind.
that can break up big pieces of ice. Again, in my experience, that is one of the scarier things to be on viscerally if you're on ice that's moving up and down with wave action, which is typical if you've been out on Lake Champlain, like on, like on south of the bridge or in the Narrows when the top is open and the waves are coming down, or up by Isle La Motte earlier in the season. Like, that's a very common place, but that tends to be a slower process and not just everything explodes and disappears, as long as your ice is thick enough. And if there's ice blowing down the lake from sheets in other places, that actually reinforces that edge. I've seen situations where there's been 5-foot waves on the lake for like several days in a row, and that ice edge barely moves because it's just been blowing into it. And then we talked about water temperature differential as it relates to current. So that's when, just the idea that when you have open water on the lake, you likely have more current happening going through shallow areas, reefs, and stuff like that. This is one of the brothers. These plates are about 5 inches thick or 4.5. These are of the age of the day that ice cleared. This was from a few days ago, and just massive 7 and 8 foot piles of this stuff up on the Four Brothers from the ice clearing in those events. All right, so I think, and then we talked, this picture's from earlier, we talked about that before. This is kind of relates to this, is, can people see this line of mist here in the distance? One of the things about being out there early in the morning, particularly when it's still, is you can see everything. You can see the smoke coming off the water or the mist coming off the water. And this is super helpful if you're on a lake where you don't know what's going on. And one of the reasons I like to be out there early in the morning, because once it heats up and there's not that big temperature differential between water and the air temperature, and some wind picks up, you can't see that. But those are really, really important clues for me when I'm out there. Yes?
What does the mist mean?
That means open water or really thin ice. In this case, it was really thin ice on this day, but it was ice, that was probably like, 0 degrees or something. And that was, a half-inch thick ice that had formed the night before. And if it's really cold, you'll see mist coming off of ice that's usually up to like 4 or 5 inches. I was out on Sebago at like -15 a few weeks ago, and the whole lake was covered with mist. I'd been on it the day before. I knew what was out there, but there was moisture because of the extreme temperature differential, moisture being drawn through 4 inches of ice. And these are also the conditions that typically create frost feathers when you have that moisture coming through the ice and then right atmospheric conditions. This is off the tip of Providence Island, looking out towards Stave, probably a couple weeks ago, when I skated up just around the Vermont, or around the shoreline. And these are just some massive, massive flow ice that anybody who's out on the lake had fun crossing these flows. But I thought it was a cool picture and a good example of just the massive range of ice you can have out there. See, that is Apple Tree Point. Yeah.
Rock Point.
Rock Point. Yeah, Rock Point. Yeah, that's right. Yep. Thanks. And it was beautiful. And that's off of Letty, I think, at the end of our long skate we did the other day. All right. And I think that's the end of this part of the show. I think it's probably, if we want to do any questions now and then taking another short break, because I see eyelids drooping and stuff. And then we can have, I think it looks like it's 6:45. And then I just want to have the last part. I just wanted to have like a question and answer and a sharing of just some details of rescue, beyond, like, we should all know what the tools are and basically how to use them, but there are some details that I think don't really get shared properly on listserv conversations. And a lot of those have to do with sometimes how to use the tools, but often just the group dynamics that happen out there and the leadership required to perform a successful rescue, of which we are all capable of that leadership, but just knowing like this is kind of generally how it works. So that's what I'd like to end with after our break. But any questions on these subjects? All right, great. Dan.
This is the time to clear the food by eating it.
Yeah.
Or,
I had one more question from Dan, and then, yeah.
Can you talk about pitch change? When, you talk
Oh.
about ice thickness.
Yeah. Yeah, I haven't really talked a lot about ice reading in this, and so ice reading often is visual. It's that whole list of things, that whole history of things and research I do before I get on the ice. But then pitch change is. Are people familiar with that? So particularly in Scandinavia, there's a lot of and it's really relative to the quality of the kind of ice you're on. So particularly when a lot of the skating is on sea ice, there's certain pitches and they're going to be the same all the time in that same salinity water that freezes under similar conditions. But generally, the higher the pitch, the thinner the ice. You're going to hear. So if you're generally with ice pitch, the skater can't hear. You can stop and you can stamp your skate on the ice and you can hear it that way. But oftentimes people are a little nervous at that point, like, wait, I'm not going to stamp my skate. But usually it's the person following's job to alert the person in front. Oh, I'm hearing a pitch change. And in the group I travel with, that's kind of like how it works. I'm always hearing that. Oh, pitch went up. Yeah. And the other place that pitch is going to change is when you have open water near. So if you have a crack, like a wet crack or some open water, and it's particularly good for indicators of wet cracks. If you're going along and you're testing and the ice thickness hasn't changed, but the pitch has changed, it means there's probably open water because that actually changes the pitch. When that sound wave traveling through the ice hits open water, it tends to get higher pitch. Yes.
Do you mean the pitch as you're skating, it's the sound of your skate, the pitch, that sound? Or?
Yeah, well, it's kind of, if you think about like that kind of Star Wars blaster sound you hear on the ice, some of that comes from just like the ice movement itself, but you also hear that when people are skating across it. So when that blaster sound gets higher and higher and higher, the ice is getting thinner and thinner and thinner. And so if you're skating with partners, it's really your partners, whoever's behind job. Yes?
also, like, I also notice the frequency, like, for example, like, when it's thicker ice, it's and then like when it's thinner ice, it's
Yes.
just like going in more frequent and higher pitch.
Yeah, so you can think about that long wave probably just getting, I don't know exactly how they work, but just getting tighter and higher. Something that I'll do on thin ice, if I'm traveling across thin ice that's challenging to read, and I've tested all, and I'm kind of sick of stopping to test it, and I'll skate closer to shore because when there's an echo offshore, you can hear the pitch of your own skates. So that's like a strategy I'll use if I feel like this feels pretty good, but and I'm gonna stop testing as frequently, but I still wanna know. I'll go next to shore, and works less good on a beach and better on cliffs because it's gotta echo back to you from somewhere. All right, great. Well, why don't we take a break and fuel up for the last probably half an hour or so. All right. So what I would like to do for the next spot, I did bring in some gear. I think I just brought in kind of like my kit. Looks like I forgot my helmet. I never forget my helmet when I'm skating, but I think it's in the car. But I've got everything else. And so I would like to talk with that, but I'm going to maybe leave that till the end, just so that for people who don't want to talk about that or know all about the gear, they can leave before that. And I think that would be appropriate, just because as soon as we start talking about gear, it tends to take a long time.
Nerds come out.
Yes, yeah, the nerds come out. Once the nerds come out, then, But if you showed up to this, you can classify yourself as a nerd anyways. So, so what I'd like to talk about next is not necessarily rescue gear, but we can talk about it as it pertains to the rescues, but more some of the dynamics that happen during rescues and just some strategies that we can use as members of a skate party before we go out and while we're on the ice to have more effective rescues that we feel more comfortable about. And then also maybe have some options for those kind of worst case scenario rescues that we're just thinking, oh, I hope that doesn't happen to me. And if you're participating in something where like that's your plan, you should try to solve that problem or just not be there, because we're all like that. We get into stuff and then there's this little thing in the corner, well, I hope that doesn't happen. And sometimes there are objective hazards, but if there are things that you just don't know the answer to that you want to, like hopefully we can problem solve through some of those here. I asked Rob, I don't know if Rob shared, I'm not sure who posted that rescue on the listserv.
There were at least 3 different people that
Yes.
their experience.
Yeah. So there was a successful rescue that happened up off of Alberg, up off of Alberg, and I thought it was a really great rescue. I thought it was just a really good discussion, but some things did not go perfectly smoothly, and so I don't know, Rob, if you would like to just recount like just a brief of like what happened, like what happened, yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and maybe stand up, yeah.
I might stand near you so that it
great.
gets picked up on the microphone.
Oh, yeah. Well, actually, this microphone doesn't register.
Oh, well, then it doesn't matter.
It goes on the camera. That's right. Yes.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So I'll talk at the camera.
Yeah.
So that was actually my 43rd birthday, and it was a weekday. I should have been working, but she and I played hooky while our son was in school and went skating with a group of people who sort of like pre-planned. We knew we were going to be in the islands. People had scouted the general area. We made the decision to go just a little bit further north on the east shore of Alberg. So you're still on the inland sea, but it is, if Evan had that map up where the current from Missisquoi Bay is coming down, there is current. We knew there was current. We had discussed it. The ice was thick. The ice was about 5 to 6 inches. But it was a little bit tricky to read. It was not fresh black ice. There were features to it. There were sort of characteristics to it that were tricky to read, and in retrospect, I did not understand what I was skating on at first.
I believe it had been snowed on and then rained on at some point.
Yeah, and so there were very interesting sort of circular features, which, you'll often see like sort of the snow will drift and then like the rain falls on it. You get these interesting circles. And so I thought I was skating on oftentimes just frozen over snowdrifts. And so I went off and sort of, just did a loop on my own to just get some distance in. And I was coming back to the main group, and I oftentimes just sort of like go over a feature as opposed to going around it. And this time, what I thought was a snowbank was actually a wind hole. And I just went straight in to a wind hole that I think she describes as perfectly Rob-sized.
Yeah.
And so I was going relatively quickly, so I kind of hit my waist on the 6-inch ice on that hole. But that ice was quite thick all around me. And I was, I don't know, maybe 100 yards from the main group that I was trying to rejoin. And so I was able to rescue myself with ice claws. I was wearing all the gear, including a dry suit, a waterproof backpack, dry suit, and flotation, or like a life jacket. So I was able to pull myself out pretty quickly. I think the ice broke on me once, and then I was basically able to be out by the time one of the people was coming to help me if needed. And I basically told her, don't worry, I can pull myself out.
And in that situation, was that a little snowdrift you were skating over?
That's what I thought it was, but it was actually a wind hole. So the snowdrift and the wind hole that it healed looked quite similar.
Okay.
So it was basically,
but it was hard ice, not snow.
Yes.
But it looked like either like a slushed out snowdrift but actually it was a wind hole.
That's right.
Got it. Okay, great.
Yep. I think that for that portion of the rescue, because there was more that happened that day, it was a very exciting day. I'm pretty happy with the way I did to rescue myself. What I should have done though, what you should always do, is turn around and go back to the ice that I knew was good, because there was a little bit of like thinner ice that I did break through, so I did waste a little bit of energy. But the fact is I pulled myself out, I basically poured the water out of my boots, and I was able to continue the skate. And so that was that portion, the self-rescue portion of the day. I guess then we can turn our attention to the next portion of the day, which was at the end of the skate, as we were getting toward the boat ramp. I would say, what do you guys think? Maybe 200 yards, 300 yards from the boat ramp? We're pretty close. And I was, again, had gone off in another group and was rejoining the larger group. And I basically looked up and I saw a skater in the water. And so I think she and I basically at the same time skated full speed toward that group. And here's where I think there are some lessons that I have learned that I think that in retrospect I would have done a little bit differently. So one of the principles you'll learn in any like emergency rescue is make sure you keep yourself safe to begin with. I did an okay job of that, but I did skate basically full speed to the ice. And I saw where the transition was. I sort of knew what I was looking at, where there were wind holes. I basically, stopped there, but I really should have been a little bit more cautious because, like, if I had been too excited, I could have very easily skated onto thin ice and been someone that had to be rescued later. As it was, though, we were able to get to what we knew was good ice. I basically dropped my pack, threw my poles out of the way, and got to my throw bag, which is I always keep accessible handy. Threw the bag directly to one of...
And you were wearing a PFD as well, so you still
That's
had
correct.
flotation
That's
in this
correct.
situation, yeah?
It's basically, but I don't want my backpack on
Yeah.
just for like maneuverability and everything. And so I had my throw bag, threw it to the person, and here's the second mistake that I made. She had been in the water for a little bit of time. She was not wearing a dry suit and she was floating on her back. I think her hands were a little bit cold, so she just tried to grab onto the rope. And then that went through her hands and she held onto the rope bag. As we were pulling, I don't know how long those ropes are. They're probably 30.
I think they're like 80 or 70 or 80. They're in that range, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So basically, I ended up pulling all of that slack while she's just sitting there holding the bag, right? That's like time wasted. What I should have told her is wrap it around your wrists and we'll pull you out. And so that didn't happen, but we got her to the edge of the hole, but she wasn't strong enough because, again, she was probably cold, to hold on to the rope itself and have us pull her out. And so I ended up, knowing that the ice was thick, knowing that I have a dry suit and that I can rescue myself, I laid down on the ice, basically prone on the thick ice and was able to grab her and physically pull her out.
Using her backpack strap, right?
I think I grabbed her backpack strap first, but I thought I got her arm. I don't remember. It was very exciting.
Was she still on her back, or had she?
I think by that time, do you remember?
She went from back to front edge.
Yeah.
But she had been pulled initially. She was holding onto the rope while she was on her back.
Right.
At the point where she couldn't, my question was, at the point where she couldn't hold on to it enough for you to pull her up, was she still on her back at that point, or had she flipped to her stomach?
No, she might. No. Oh, you were also in parallel.
I was in the water.
Yeah. Okay. So.
Yeah.
So we can have multiple perspectives
Yeah.
from this
Yeah.
whole day. I'm just giving my perspective right now, right?
Okay.
And so when, so I don't remember exactly what position. I think she must have been on her front, but she was fairly upright, right? She wasn't sort of in that horizontal position you want for rescuing.
Yeah.
But she's also quite small, and I was just able to pull her out. I think one of the big things was that she was not wearing a dry suit, and she didn't have a change of clothes on her. I always carry a change of clothes, even though I wear a dry suit. Not for myself necessarily, but exactly for this situation. But I didn't push it. I didn't say, you should change right now on the ice. In retrospect, I don't know if that would have been better or not. But basically, she and another person skated back with the person that had just been rescued to their car to help change her while I dealt with like cleaning up all the rescue stuff, because just everything was everywhere, as one would expect.
How long was the skate to the car?
Oh, not long.
Probably 200 yards.
Okay, yeah, I mean, that was the right decision.
Yeah,
Yep.
Yep. Yeah, it was pretty short, but it is tricky ice there, and so I think you were like supporting her, right? Just because
we were just like one on each of her sides, is making sure she's able to
get to shore.
It's not quite double pulling ice, but it wasn't pleasant. And so I think getting her out of the wet clothes was very helpful to have multiple people. One of the things that I wish I had been a little bit more vocal about was not to let her just drive away once she was changed. And actually what happened was she was in her car and she was like, I'm fine, I'm gonna drive home. And really, I wish we had not allowed her to have her keys and someone had driven her like home, you know, in a way that like, you know, has time to warm up. She was shivering when she was at the car, which is a good sign, right? If she's not shivering, then that's actually something to be more worried about. I don't know, what other details am I missing?
I think that's pretty good, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, she didn't want to lose her poles,
Oh,
even though they float. So, yeah.
Got it. Yeah. So she had her as having trouble getting on the ice, but then she also had her hands full with her poles at the same time, and then also holding onto a rope. So was she trying to hold onto the rope with one hand because of her poles, or have the poles like in the mix?
Yeah.
And this was happening while you were trying to get her out.
Yeah.
Okay.
Roberta might speak to what happened to her, which was.
Yeah, but the other thing that I want to mention about that first person, and I want to ask your opinion on this, she consciously got on her back to try to do a back stroke. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's like one of the major things when I read that report is like every rescue begins with a self-rescue. That was like a mantra was beat into my head as a whitewater paddler. Every rescue begins with a self-rescue, and a self-rescue for skating means being on your stomach, kicking your legs till they're up behind you, facing towards the ice edge. That's the body position for a self-rescue. From there, you go for your ice claws, or you've done that at the same time. So in this situation, that didn't happen. And then the other thing is the ice poles, right? Like the priority is people and then the gear. Right, and so if things aren't going well for the people, the gear is just a secondary thing, and the ice poles could have potentially been chucked forward or whatever. But just as a tip, ice poles can pretty easily be retrieved off of thin ice with a throw rope. So just like if you get in that situation, you're making that decision, leave them behind. Also, the next day you can usually get them too, depending on conditions. So yeah, body position was really important, and I think that is kind of like, that's one of the reasons I know, like at some point during this you fell in, like, was that correct? Were you the one that fell? Yeah.
And I did that rookie mistake. I should know better. I went a beeline to help her.
Yeah.
And I went.
And I don't think we need to discuss, that's pretty clear. Don't do that or avoid that and whatever. I don't think there's a lot into that. What I think is interesting about this rescue is that the person in the water, which is very typical, like they'd just gone through water, they just gone through the ice. They are older. This is also one of the most experienced people in our skating community. She's been skating forever, but also has not worn proper gear forever too, but
I found out that was her first time going for a swim.
Yeah.
Ever, so
it's
pretty amazing.
Yeah, and I think she's been skating for 30 years, or a long time. So anyways, just that's one of those things is like, if you go home and watch a proper video. Dan's got a great video out there. There's some great ones from Scandinavia about the proper body position. Know what that looks like, and be willing in that situation to direct that person in the water to get in the right position, because that would have changed everything, and it would have made it quicker, and it would have made the whole rescue feel a little bit more successful, because you were battling some poor body position the whole time, to the point where you had to actually physically get her out of the ice. So I think those are just some things that I thought this was a really good rescue, because you folks did such a great job reporting it. That's just one of those leadership things of learn what to do, and then be willing to tell people what to do, and then also try to have the discipline as a group to have one person doing that. Doesn't need to be the smartest person or the best person or the most experienced person. It just needs to be one person that has a reasonable idea for making the rescue successful. Rescues are not about who has the best idea. Rescues are about getting an idea that will work and going with it, and not bickering over the details of it. That's just one of those critical things, those leadership moments of like taking the time to fix the problem, so that you don't have to fix 3 other problems that happen along the way with that. And so that's just kind of like something I really want to reinforce with folks, and to in all rescue training, whether it's like it's special forces or it's fire departments or it's police or it's mountain rescue units or people who are doing anything in really risky situations, there's a ton of scientific evidence and then just data on being blunt, being able to contradict people in a way that you're not arguing, being blunt, being the person who maybe doesn't take control of the rescue, but takes control and says, let's just go with one person's idea, it's this person, and let that person go for it, because you've seen both these ideas are gonna work. We just need one to work because time is of the issue when someone's in the water. We don't need to insanely rush, but we do want to get them out of the water. So those are some really, that's a really critical piece in rescue, is just being blunt, having the willingness to make a decision, and not discussing until you have the absolute best plan, because there's usually a lot of good plans. And then the other thing is coming out of that rescue knowing you were successful. That was a successful, really well done rescue. Rescues are messy. They're always messy unless you have everybody is highly trained, from the rescuer to all the rescuees. And generally, they're messy, And so, like, you may be experienced in your small group of people, things have happened a bunch and they were always smooth, but at some point, it's going to be messy. Again, because you get a little bit beyond your knowledge range. And to accept that and to understand that success is you've got the person out of the water, you've got them back to their car and they're safe. And you've got a little cleanup to do maybe on some details. And that's why it was like so great you reported this, so great people put in all the effort into explaining the details on it, because it was a rescue we all had a lot to learn from. We don't have a lot to learn from every rescue. I don't think every swim needs to be reported, but it's good to report most of them, or when there are things that you learn from it. There's probably a case to be made for reporting every swim, but we don't really have a credible body to report to at this point in our skating community like they do in Scandinavia, where every accident, every near miss, every swim is reported and compiled. Every adjacent, and that'd be a really important thing for us to do as a community, but if you're just on the listserv, it just kind of goes away. So any other thoughts on that rescue situation? Thank you, Rob. That was great.
Can I ask a question, Rob? You described that you fell into a Rob-sized hole, and you're moving along at a pretty fast clip, right?
Yes.
What about the physical, like, are you hurt when you fall into that hole? Like, as you're moving forward?
I did physically hit the front part of the ice,
Yeah.
and it didn't feel great.
But does it knock the wind out of you? You
That's not the part that I hit.
Never mind.
Well, there's definitely like typically there are significant bruises going through the ice like that, particularly if there's a hard ice edge and you're not going into increasingly thinner ice. So there's typically significant bruising, falling onto thicker ice like that. It's really easy to tear a rotator cuff by getting your arm up, and then that lands and shoves your shoulder up, which I've done a few times. Usually with like partial going through, like I don't go all the way through, but like I was going fast enough, my feet caught and went in, and then I got slammed down. Or in one situation where I turned around really quickly because I knew the thick ice was right. I stepped on a piece of ice that was thick enough, but it just kind of broke right apart. And I turned right around, but I didn't get all the way around. So it landed on my elbow, which I have elbow pads on, that was fine, but tore my rotator cuff a bit. So, which is now happening most winters. But
I have a question about,
Yeah.
so I wasn't able to really get myself too horizontal. I asked for the rope too quickly, I think, but part of it was my PFD. It has pockets, and like I wasn't able to like really propel myself and get myself flat. Like I don't want to go without a PFD though.
Yeah, so it is easier to get out with just a backpack on in general, but they make very specific streamlined PFDs. And you just really, skaters should be buying those specific PFDs, which is different from your kayaking PFD. with pockets in it, and there are some that prefer less. They're smooth. They have less flotation up here, and it tapers really well, so that you can get your chest on really easily, and there's no catch points. So
And they tend to be cheaper as well. They're just
yes,
line flat foam on the front.
yes. Yeah, but you need to look for one for your body type that is going to be streamlined, because it's going to be different. PFDs fit everybody different, so it means, which is hard to get to a retail store with a good selection these days, and that's the real challenge, is like they don't carry all the PFDs anymore. But that's really important if you are going to be wearing a PFD, which I think is great. The other thing is going to a Scandinavian style backpack system. Like I've got a 30-liter bag in here, and this is the backpack that I use, but most folks in Scandinavia are using a backpack that's a third bigger than this, with probably more like 40 liters of airbag in it. So they're getting, and the crotch strap is not necessarily to keep the bag on them, although for certain body types it's necessary, but the crotch strap is to keep the bag really low, and their crotch straps are worn pretty tight. Whenever I see people in New England wearing crotch straps, they're really loose, so they're not really doing the job. They will keep the pack on you, but the crotch straps are a bit tighter, and so that the flotation is lower on the body, so that they float higher in the water. So if you're having trouble with a PFD, just get a bigger backpack, but fill it with air. Like, you don't need to have a lot of weight in there per se. You just need to have an airbag that you've trapped all the air in. I mean a dry bag, sorry. Yeah, so this is just a dry bag in here if you don't have a dry bag backpack. Dry bag backpacks are better because every inch of air inside that backpack is trapped. So if I had a backpack the same size and it was a dry bag backpack, I would probably be getting 10 more liters of trapped air in there. Yeah.
I have one of those, and one of the things I find is in the cold, it's really a pain for everything to close. It's very stiff, and so my snacks aren't always accessible. So.
Yeah, but they do make waterproof backpacks with pockets on the outside and stuff. So I think that's just a really good option. And that's why the people who have been doing this for 100+ years wear those and not PFDs. But they're committed to doing that, and everybody does it, and it's part of the culture. We're Americans, and we're slow learners, and we take our time to like figure things out from a lot of different directions.
An idea for situations where someone might not have the muscle strength, or might be so cold they can't hold on to the rope.
Yes.
Attaching a helmet, your helmet to the end of the rope, get them much easier to hold on to the physical strength and the grip.
And this is not something I use mostly because I know my own physical abilities and I have other options and a lot of other skills, but as part of, I don't have their whole strap system with me, but in a Scandinavian setup, they're gonna have their throw bag so they can reach it. It's gonna be attached to a strap that then is attached to their backpack so they can throw the bag out of the water. It's really hard to do that unless you're floating high. That's where their big backpacks come in handy. But then as part of that, there's a carabiner right here. And so in that situation, the throw bag in the situation of this rescue, that carabiner loop, that loop at the bottom of the throw bag could have been clipped right into this carabiner. And then 2 hands are free to help breach the ice surface.
Actually, the first thing I did when I got home was I put a carabiner at the bottom of my throw bag, specifically so that when that person gets to the end of the bag and they don't have another option, they at least can clip that carabiner in.
Yeah, and that's a good way to go. You just have to be careful about hitting people in the teeth with it. But this is the better way to go, right? Because then that person with cold hands, it's a lot harder to try to get the carabiner around something than it is to clip through a rope through an unlocked carabiner.
But that also relies on the person having the carabiner.
Yes, and this is. Yeah, this is where the cold, exactly. So it's a double up. I think this is better, but if this doesn't exist, because it might not, then that's really good. Which I did think about, like as I was thinking about your rescue, because I don't keep a carabiner on my throw bag. So That's kind of part of their system. They have a system where you can throw it out of the hole to somebody, and if you receive a bag, you can clip it in. Getting out of the water quick is beneficial in a lot of ways. You can hold on to a throw bag if if you grab it, if you're able to grab it with two hands and you pull it and you break it like this, so you know how to hold on to the rope. You don't need to wrap it around anything. It is okay in that situation to wrap. But I've been rescued by a throw bag and rescued other people, and they've always just been able to hold on to it. But they've also been people who handled ropes, climbing and other ways to do that. So because of the disadvantage of going through 70 feet of rope, which just takes longer, and particularly going through in a dry suit, the less time you're in, because you have cuffs over your boots, if you can get out really quickly, your boots remain pretty much dry. And so 15 seconds makes a big difference. And so that's why I hold on, but by clipping into the bag is a good option for that. And check out a full Scandinavian setup. We probably should all be using them. They've been tested, and it's been slower for our culture to adopt, and me as well, to everything that they do. But yes.
Can I see a show of hands who does not skate with a backpack? Just for information. So everybody here has a backpack? One or two don't. I just want to say one thing. You were talking about the dry bags. And if you fill your dry bag full of clothes right to the tippy top and then seal it, that still is going to give you enough buoyancy. So don't think that the dry bag has to be just the dry bag itself. You can fill that with all your extra clothes and anything else in there. That's still going to give you the buoyancy.
Yes. Yes, I was just mentioning that, if you look at the size of the typical Scandinavian skate club pack, they're significantly bigger than the packs we all use, and a lot of that is airspace because they don't need to fill all that with gear. They do have more gear if they're not in dry suits, which they aren't, but they put a lot of air in there for that reason. But yes, you don't need to. Your backpack could be full. Yeah.
Hey, Rob, when you went in, how far did you go? Did you immerse?
I would say to my chest, because I basically had 3 independent flotation systems: PFD, dry suit, and then a fairly large dry backpack.
And you also hit an edge,
Yeah.
right? So that's going to stop your downward progress too. So even with all that stuff, if you'd skated right out onto ice that went from an inch to a half inch to nothing, or to you would have gone in farther, but you may not have got your head wet. Very rarely, I've got my beard wet, but very rarely my whole head.
Going to change subjects. I had a question. So for the self-rescue, a lot of my friends are female, and we're kind of worried about the strength needed to self-rescue. Rob says it's more like a pull-up. What do you think? What are the muscle groups that we need to be able to really get it?
I think proper rescue form is more important if you have less upper body strength. But proper rescue form is proper rescue form. If you're in proper rescue form, you have time. And women are often probably physiologically better suited to kick their legs up than men. And so I don't think you're at a significant disadvantage, certainly not by gender, but if you're just talking about upper body strength, I think it is something that you should practice more, because if you do have the ability to mantle up on thick ice, or you have a lot of upper body strength, you can have poor form and still make it work. But I think it's really about body position and keeping your center of gravity low and just working your way slowly up. And then the disadvantage of that is if you have a PFD or something in your backpack that's catching, then upper body strength is how people get around that. They rock back and forth, lift themselves up, and so really paying attention to your gear and your equipment. So I personally don't think people should have a lot of fear around that, although as we age and we significantly lose body strength, at some point, just be honest with yourself about that. Doesn't mean you don't skate, but just know that, hey, I'm gonna go with people who have some other options to rescue me. And I skate with folks with dry suit. If one of us will go in on a rope after somebody else if we need to, if they get injured on the way in or something like that. There are lots of other options, particularly if you have skilled people with you. So I'm not encouraging, I don't think people should not skate, but I think if you own a dry suit, just practice. And you're gonna just practice first on a thick ice edge, and then practice where you've got to chop your way back a bit on thin ice. And that's it. Like, and then you're gonna be comfortable, and you will be successful with practice. You know, it's just like, in the first time you try, if you haven't practiced, it's hard. And having a lot of upper body strength really evens the playing field on that.
Yeah, I mean, if you maintain that horizontal body position and kick your feet, it actually takes very little upper body strength to move forward on the ice. You're just getting over the edge and pulling across the flat. It's not doing a push-up. If you're doing a push-up, you're probably gonna break the ice anyway if it's thin, and you're gonna tighten yourself out. If you get in that horizontal position, it really is surprisingly easy once you start kind of inch your way up on the ice.
And the self-rescue for me is like a little bit more of an act of faith than a feat of strength, because at that moment, like before you get up on the ice edge and you're cooking and it's hard, like there's a part of you thinking this isn't gonna work. But there is a process. Keep kicking, keep moving your ice picks forward. If the ice breaks, just keep doing it until you're on ice that doesn't break, and it will work. But it's hard to have the faith right in there in the middle. And so that's what practice helps for, and just being confident, like I know what to do. I've watched the videos. Even if I haven't practiced it, I visualize it, I have a good idea what to do, and just keep doing it till you're successful, because you will be most likely.
Not so much fear then.
Yeah. Yeah, and just being but that is a really fearful moment. The first time you try to get out of anything and it doesn't work, you're starting to question everything, you know. Yes?
When you're picking like that, I've noticed that a couple of times that I've tried it, the skates act like a sail.
Yeah.
Can you share any techniques?
I consciously, when I get them up there, just try to do like a high flutter kick, as opposed to doing a big scissor kick. Because as soon as I get that skate down like kind of below 30 degrees or 45 degrees, then it kind of tends to go out. But I find that if I keep my feet like up there on the surface as much as possible, which is where they kind of want to be anyways, that once I get them up there, it's usually a bit if I'm fully in, it's a bit to get them up there. And I know a lot of really experienced, skilled people have felt that, like, oh, it takes a little bit to get into position. If you don't happen to fall in position, sometimes you just fall and you're in position, and you've swum around, you've had to swim around enough that you're kind of going forward towards the ice edge. Yes.
How often does anyone here use rolling as a way to get once you're up on the ice? I've seen that in demonstrations, but I'm not hearing people talk about that as a technique.
If I've got my ice picks out, then I generally just will like pull across on my ice picks. But I've used rolling a lot, like on pressure ridges. If I'm on a plate that's loosened, and whenever I go down on the ice and I haven't gone fully through, I roll. But rolling out's a good option, particularly if you're in a situation without ice picks. But ice picks allow you to remain prone and not put pressure points on the ice. But sometimes, like maybe you've chosen to get out without ice picks because you had a hard edge and you could, which is totally possible and totally doable. Maybe rolling's a good option at that point. Yep.
So I actually did that. It worked great.
Awesome.
And back to the whole like planning and preparing ahead. Roberta and I had a little safety talk before we went out recently, and it was nice to spend 5 minutes like identifying some of these things. I've also, with my kids, on thick ice, wearing PFDs and everything, we've had ice pick races.
Yeah.
Which is interesting because it takes a surprising amount of effort to pull yourself a short distance.
Yeah.
One of them beat me at it.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, are there other activities short of getting a chainsaw out and making a hole that are like that intermediate step of like mental preparation?
Well, I think that exercise, and I did the same thing with my kid, and he loved, the first few times he was there for like an hour, and we were trying to skate, and he's pulling himself along because he thought it was so great. But come to think of it, he was on the ice a lot in general. He liked to skate and slide. I think that if you're not actually going to go in the water, I think physically practicing with that's just going to give you the fortitude to keep doing it when you're questioning yourself when it didn't work the first try. But I really think that visualization, you watch the video, you figure out how to do it, visualizing it is a really powerful tool and almost as good as practice. And having the discipline to, if you haven't practiced it, having the discipline to visualize, walk yourself through the steps. First I'm gonna do this, then I'm gonna do this, then I'm gonna do this. Because that way when you go in and you go in the water, you panic, you do something wrong, nothing's working, you've got that already ingrained in the back of your head. First, I start kicking, and I try to get my body flat, or first, again, I get my ice picks out, whatever process you've decided, and you've got a plan you can go to. So I do think it's really powerful and an underestimated thing, and I think, Dan, you're big on that too, right? Yeah.
Visualization is so important.
Yeah.
If you look at the Olympics now, you see all those folks
Yeah.
ready to do the half pipe and all that. They're like,
Yeah.
they've got their motions all down in their mind.
Yeah.
So, and going down the luge runs, they know where they've got to be.
Yeah.
So visualization is just incredibly important, I think.
Piggybacking on this, like when you hit the water, if you haven't been in before, there's a natural tendency to pop up and try to just go forward to wherever it is, and it's that type of visualization and what you're thinking through is part of where you get rode into the brain. Turn around and go the way I came. So before I'm even popping up out of the water, my brain's already telling me turn around and go back the way I came. Don't just go forward. Which in the moment, it's really easy to do. If you're thin ice, you just keep breaking more ice around you. Turn around and go back the way you came. But you got to get that kind of into the brain somehow, because in the moment when you hit the ice, you don't want to have to be thinking that through it. You just want it to pop in your head.
And Dave, to build on that, especially if you're not wearing a dry suit. When you go in without a dry suit, you have cold shock immediately. You're not thinking straight. There's a panic reflex, there's a gas reflex. You need to calm yourself down and then rescue yourself. Go into your training. And that's where visualization comes in. Knowing that I'm gonna have this cold shock. I need to just cool my jets for a little bit. It's gonna be okay. Turn around, go back where I came, get my gear out and start self-rescuing. The dry suit does away with all that for the most part. It gives the rescuers a lot more time and the self-rescuer a lot more time. So if you can afford a dry suit, boy, it's a game changer, in my opinion.
And I also think I think we don't all need to be skating in dry suits, but I also think age and dry suits should meet at some point. That was always my plan when I was skating without a dry suit. I'm 50 years old, I'm still in pretty good shape, but there are some things that aren't as good as they were for sure. And I know what direction it's going, and it's not getting better. So I just think that's an important thing, just to consider. And just like pads, we had pads as we age, we had dry suits as we age, and we rethink through the things we were confident doing before and make sure that the person I am now, does that person fit in with what I'm doing, with what I'm planning to do today? Just because it's just a reality we all have to face. None of us will escape it, and if we did, we didn't get to go skating because we died young. So, I think it's really hard to practice it. A dry suit gives you an opportunity just to go out with a group of friends and practice. Don't be afraid, I would say, on your own, without a dry suit, in full layers, really layer up with shell layers as well. If you really want to practice this in a safe situation with rescue people there, you can do that. It's hard for us to offer them publicly because kind of the public standard is that there has to be EMS there. But obviously there's cold water swimmers all the time jumping in ice holes in Lake Champlain and stuff. And so I think it's something that can be practiced, but just do it under very specific conditions. You can do this in shallow water where you can stand right up, because the proper rescue does not involve having to have depth. And then you have the option just to walk right out if you feel uncomfortable. And having a lot of layers on will keep that cold shock away too. There's also a big difference between being really physically active and skating hard and going in and being already a little chilled and going in. It's just a world of difference, Yes, Dan.
I bet Kitty and Chi could probably organize something like that.
Under the table. Though.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so here's a question.
Yeah.
So say a group of people is practicing this on their own, how does one mitigate someone on the shore calling? I mean, that's actually been a factor I've considered in terms of like the neighbors watching and getting concerned as I'm fishing chi out of the lake for fun.
Yeah, I mean that's certainly being discreet about where you're doing it is probably an issue, especially in this more populated area. You know, like Vermont is a little less police and rescue heavy. Like in New Hampshire, like people call the police on you at whenever for anything. Yeah, freedom involves heavy surveillance. Yeah, 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 yeah. Dan?
What I would suggest is talk to your local EMS people.
Yeah, well.
Because they're looking for opportunities to practice too. And they like to tell people what their procedure is. So that if you get in a situation, you know, oh, okay, they're gonna want me to do this and that. Well, we did it in Saranac Lake, right, Rob? And the fire chief was there and he's asked me to do it again.
And did he have like his like a dry suit and with stuff for him? They had all. So they just came out and used it as a practice session.
Well,
Yeah.
what happened was I contacted him too late, with not enough time, so he couldn't get his guys out that weekend. But he had all the gear there, and he talked to the group, and he showed the gear and explained what the gear was used for and whatnot. But he's told me, you know, give me more time and we can get a crew out there and we can do rescues and
Great.
You know, the Gumby suits and all that stuff.
Great. And that if that happened there, it can probably happen other places too. So I would just I mean I'd recommend that if you want to do a formal thing, and don't hesitate to do informal things as well. We've got it's about 10 minutes to 8, so I just want to be conscious of time here. Chi, do you mind if I just like briefly summarize your rescue situation from the other day, what you told me? Just for time. So like Chi reported on the list the other day that she went in and just like kind of standing on thin ice, was about to check it, and there was off of Letty Beach, and then you were trying to get yourself out. Your PFD was riding up, your helmet was kind of flopping down, and then at some point rescuers threw you a throw bag, but you didn't know it was there. I just wanted to, and then the rescue went fine after that, and no big problem. But I just wanted to, I thought that was like just a good situation, is that's also very typical that the person in the water, especially if they know what to do, they're focused on their visualization what to do, and they're not paying attention necessarily to what's around them. If they're not someone who's just like looking to be saved, which you were not, then it took a little longer because you didn't see the rope, and you had enough thin ice that it was worth having a rope there. So I just wanted to point that out, and then how your gear fits. If you're wearing a PFD, if you're wearing a helmet, like having it actually fit properly and snugly, so when you're in the water, it's not then causing problems for you. And that's going to vary with body types as to what kind of PFD will work, how you have it fastened. But another advantage of the backpack over the PFD. And then that was a throw bag. You were successfully rescued by a throw bag in the end, right?
Yeah, I did the wraparound arm.
You did the wraparound, and then who hauled you? Oh yeah, and then you hauled her out.
Yeah.
Great.
Two of them were here.
Great.
She was really far away, so I couldn't hear her voice.
Yeah.
She was scared to get closer, so she was pretty far.
Yeah.
I was end up with her. She's through rope first.
Yeah.
She got there earlier and could get the rope faster than me.
Yeah.
But I couldn't reach, so I had to get closer to the rope, which
Yeah.
is a little more closer than
Yeah.
what I wanted to be.
Yeah.
And grab.
Yeah.
And then I tried to communicate with her, but she couldn't hear my voice.
Yes.
I noticed she was struggling.
Yeah.
So I threw it at her, and it dropped in right in front of her. Couldn't see it, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. At that point, did you say "got it first try"?
I'm sorry.
Did you say "got it first try"?
Yes.
That would have been the moment to say "got it first try."
But the important thing is she's lighter and I'm heavier than her, so I was able to pull her out, but still had a lot of strength. Knowing somebody else is far holding, but it was not the good workout because we can't communicate. We
Yeah.
totally follow each other.
Yes.
So we couldn't maximize our
Yeah.
strength together.
I think.
Couldn't communicate because I was trying to communicate with her
Yeah.
without hearing what's going on. So
Do you feel like it was your strength alone that pulled her out?
I felt that.
Yeah, because it just wasn't in line or whatever how she was pulling.
I
Yeah.
wasn't ready to reform my position after she grabbed it because I felt like she was ready to pull, and I said don't because she hasn't grabbed yet.
Yeah.
So I didn't have a reposition to step away to pull her.
Yeah.
So I started pulling her. I knew I was too close because I was 5 yards away.
Yeah.
Even though the ice was thick enough.
Yeah.
I
You wanted to be farther away from the hole.
wanted
Yeah.
to be more
Yeah.
farther. But blade was perpendicular to the ropes. So
Yes.
It helped, but one side of the leg was not fully attaching on the ice because I was lower position.
Yeah.
So the position of pulling a
Yeah.
person has to be right, lower, and both edge has to be perpendicular.
Yeah, both edges have to be on, and then also you can have your legs do the work too, and it will take some practice, but you can step back with your skates, and you can just move back and not have to pull them up with your arms.
So most important, I'm not a strong person, I
Yeah.
consider to pull heavier people. So if I have someone back up right behind me, more closer, will I think maximizing the strength of pulling rather than having fall out? So I was gonna question about that.
I think you made a good choice being away from the edge. I think the key thing to remember is like that it doesn't sound like you were actively stepping away, and that's a way for you to secure yourself to the rope and then use your legs to pull them out. It doesn't require an enormous amount of force, particularly if they're able to get themselves in a good position. My wife has rescued me, and she's 130 pounds, and I'm like 210 pounds, and she hauled me right out. So I don't think you have a lot of leverage there. It's just learning how to use it. It's something to practice. Yeah. Well, I think there's a lot more to talk about on this subject, but I think we're kind of out of time. But I hope this is just a beginning of discussions. And as far as rescue goes, I just want to reinforce for folks to have a meeting, have just a quick talk, unless you're with the people you skate with all the time and you all know the plan. If you've got new people in the party, or even if you feel like, yeah, there's some stuff for us to learn as a group, just have that quick discussion about like what we're doing, what we're gonna go with, and have a sense of like the people in your group that you're gonna go to as leaders in a situation. So that's an easy plan. Like we know, like, oh well, you know, Kitty and Rob probably have the most experience in this particular group. Like if it's not one of them in the water, we'll maybe depend on one of them to direct the rescue. Everybody, obviously, people can get started with a rescue, but just having someone you know is kind of the person you're going to go to can be helpful. But being flexible with that, because you know Rob may be way down the ice, and Kitty may be in the water, and someone else has got to start. But just working towards that, kind of like having one leader in that situation. Not a big fan of autocracy in general. It works well in rescue situations. But the democracy comes in with the discussion you have beforehand and the debrief you have afterwards, instead of walking away and someone's a hero and everybody else sucked, because that's not how the world works.
Thank you, Evan.
Yeah.